Welcome, fellow dreamer. You have found a place of calm and rest. This evening, we're going to explore the remarkable journey of human evolution, tracing the gentle path from our earliest ancestors through millions of years to the people we are today. We'll wander through ancient landscapes, discover the fossils that tell our story, and follow the great migrations that carried humanity across every corner of the earth. Accompanied by soothing music and abstract imagery, we'll be uncovering little-known wonders and fascinating stories that gently feed your curiosity as you drift towards sleep. If you enjoy these calm adventures with us, don't be shy. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment to help other smart sleepers dream too. And now, take a deep breath. Let your body sink into comfort and allow your mind to rest and your eyes to close as the tale unfolds before you. The story of humanity begins long before humans existed. Our journey starts not millions but billions of years ago, when Earth itself was a young planet, still finding its character beneath unfamiliar skies. To understand where we came from, we must first travel back to a time when the very notion of complex life seemed impossibly distant, when the world was inhabited not by creatures we would recognize, but by the humblest forms of existence imaginable. Picture Earth around 3.5 billion years ago. The landscape would seem alien to us now, the atmosphere unbreathable, the oceans a different chemistry entirely. Yet somewhere in those ancient waters, something extraordinary happened. Simple organic molecules, through processes scientists are still working to fully understand, organized themselves into the first living cells. These weren't the sophisticated cells that make up our bodies today, but rather simple packages of chemistry that could do something no non-living matter could achieve. They could make copies of themselves. These earliest life forms were single-celled organisms, invisible to the naked eye, yet they possessed the fundamental characteristic that defines all life. They could reproduce, passing their characteristics to the next generation. Over countless generations, tiny variations accumulated, and the process we call evolution began its patient, unhurried work. For billions of years, life remained primarily single-celled and aquatic. The pace of change during this immense span of time should not suggest stagnation, however. Even among single-celled organisms, evolution was experimenting, diversifying, solving problems of survival in countless creative ways. Some of these ancient organisms learned to harvest energy from sunlight through photosynthesis, fundamentally transforming the planet by releasing oxygen as a byproduct. This oxygen gradually accumulated in the atmosphere, eventually creating conditions that would allow more complex life to flourish. Around 2 billion years ago, another pivotal development occurred. Certain cells became more complex, developing internal compartments and structures. These were the first eukaryotic cells, the kind that would eventually give rise to all plants, animals, and fungi. The emergence of these more sophisticated cells opened new possibilities for what life could become. Yet even after this innovation, life remained microscopic for hundreds of millions of years more. The progression toward complexity occurred not through any conscious direction, but through the simple mechanics of natural selection. Organisms that were better suited to their environments tended to survive and reproduce more successfully. Those less suited left fewer descendants. Generation after generation, advantageous traits became more common, while disadvantageous ones faded away. Around 600 million years ago, something remarkable began to happen in Earth's oceans. Multicelled organisms started to appear with increasing frequency in the fossil record. These weren't merely clusters of identical cells, but organized bodies where different cells performed different functions. Some cells specialized in gathering nutrients, others in movement, still others in sensing the environment. This division of labor allowed organisms to grow larger and more complex than ever before. The fossil record from this period reveals an explosion of diversity, with new body plans appearing in what seems by geological standards to be a relatively brief interval. Creatures developed shells, segments, limbs, and sensory organs. The ancestors of nearly all modern animal groups emerged during this creative flourishing of life. As hundreds of millions of years continued to unfold, life colonized the land. Plants arrived first, transforming barren rock into soil, and creating opportunities for animals to follow. Invertebrates crawled from the water, then vertebrates, our own distant ancestors among them. Fish developed limbs and lungs, becoming the first amphibians. Some of these amphibians evolved waterproof skin and eggs, becoming reptiles freed from dependence on water for reproduction. From certain reptilian lineages emerged the mammals, a group that would eventually include us. Early mammals were small, often nocturnal creatures living in a world dominated by dinosaurs. They possessed characteristics that distinguished them from reptiles. They were warm-blooded, grew hair, and nourished their young with milk. These traits, which seemed modest at the time, would prove crucial to the story of our own origins. When the age of dinosaurs ended around 66 million years ago, likely due to a catastrophic asteroid impact, mammals found new opportunities in the changed world. They diversified rapidly, evolving into many different forms, adapted to different ways of life. Some returned to the oceans, becoming whales and dolphins. Others took to the air as bats. Many remained on land, growing larger and more varied. Among these diversifying mammals, one group developed characteristics suited for life in the trees. These were the early primates, appearing in the fossil record around 55 to 60 million years ago. They possessed grasping hands with opposable digits, forward-facing eyes that provided depth perception, and relatively large brains compared to their body size. These adaptations served them well in the three-dimensional world of the forest canopy, where judging distances and grasping branches meant the difference between life and death. The primate lineage continued to branch and diversify. Some primates remained small, like the ancestors of modern lemurs and tarsiers. Others grew larger, becoming the ancestors of monkeys and apes. Each branch of this family tree represented a different solution to the challenge of survival, a different way of finding food, avoiding predators, and raising offspring successfully. Everything that came before, the first cells, the development of complexity, the colonization of land, the rise of mammals, the emergence of primates, was essential to the story of human evolution. We are not separate from this deep history, but rather its continuation. Every cell in our bodies carries echoes of that ancient single-celled ancestor. Our backbone traces its heritage to those first fish that ventured onto land. Our warm blood and milk-producing glands mark us as mammals. Our grasping hands and forward-facing eyes reveal our primate heritage. As we prepare to explore the more recent chapters of our story, it helps to remember this vast prologue. We exist because of billions of years of evolutionary experimentation, countless small changes accumulating across unimaginable spans of time. We stand not at the pinnacle of creation, but rather at one branch among many in the great tree of life, connected to every living thing through chains of ancestry stretching back to the beginning. Now that we've journeyed through the vast expanses of deep time and witnessed the remarkable unfolding of life on our planet, we find ourselves ready to narrow our focus. We're going to explore a particular branch of the tree of life, one that leads directly to us. To understand where humans came from, we must first understand where we fit within the living world around us. We are not isolated creatures without context or connection. We belong to a family, and that family is the primates. When we speak of primates, we're speaking of an order of mammals that first appeared in the fossil record roughly 60 million years ago, not long after the dinosaurs vanished from the Earth. This group began as small, tree-dwelling creatures that developed certain specialized features to navigate life among the branches. These features would prove to be remarkably important, not just for survival in the trees, but for the eventual emergence of beings capable of contemplating their own existence. Picture those ancient forests, thick with vegetation, where visibility was limited and movement required careful coordination. The creatures that thrived in this environment developed forward-facing eyes, which provided them with stereoscopic vision. This three-dimensional sight allowed them to judge distances accurately as they leaped from branch to branch. It's a feature we still possess today, and one we rarely pause to appreciate, yet it fundamentally shapes how we perceive the world. Along with these eyes came grasping hands, equipped with opposable thumbs or digits that could wrap around branches. These hands became instruments of exploration and manipulation. The sensitive pads on primate fingers could detect texture and temperature, gathering information about the environment through touch. Over millions of years, primates refined their ability to manipulate objects with precision, a trait that would eventually enable tool-making and countless other achievements. The primate family tree is remarkably diverse. At its base, we find the more distant relatives, the prosimians, which include lemurs, lorises, and tarsiers. These creatures retain many ancient primate characteristics and offer us glimpses into what the earliest members of our order might have resembled. Lemurs, confined today to the island of Madagascar, leap through the trees with their long tails trailing behind them, their large eyes adapted for nocturnal vision. They remind us that evolutionary success takes many forms and that survival doesn't require complexity for its own sake. As we move along the branches of the primate tree, we encounter the monkeys, divided into two broad groups, separated by an ocean. The monkeys of Central and South America, the New World monkeys, evolved in isolation for millions of years. They developed prehensile tails that function almost like a fifth limb, allowing them to hang securely while feeding. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Old World monkeys of Africa and Asia followed their own evolutionary path. Without prehensile tails, they developed other adaptations, including more complex social structures and specialized diets. Then we arrive at a group that holds particular significance for our story, the apes. This superfamily, known scientifically as the hominoids, includes the gibbons of Southeast Asia, with their remarkable arm-swinging locomotion, and what we call the great apes. The great apes are our closest living relatives, and examining them is like looking at variations on a theme, with humans being one particular variation. The orangutans of Borneo and Sumatra are largely solitary, spending their days in the forest canopy, using their extraordinary arm strength to move through the trees. Gorillas, the gentle giants of African forests, live in stable family groups, led by a silverback male. They're primarily terrestrial, walking on their knuckles as they forage for vegetation. Chimpanzees and bonobos, both found in Africa, are perhaps our most fascinating relatives, displaying remarkable intelligence, complex social behaviors, and even cultural traditions that vary between different communities. What unites all these apes, including humans, are certain shared characteristics. We lack tails, having lost them somewhere in our evolutionary history. We have relatively large brains compared to our body size. We have flexible shoulder joints that allow for a wide range of arm movement. We show extended periods of childhood development, during which young individuals learn from their elders, and we display complex social behaviors that require us to navigate intricate relationships within our communities. The realization that humans are apes was revolutionary when it first emerged in scientific thought. For many people, even today, there's discomfort with this classification, yet it's simply a reflection of our biological history, a statement about ancestry and relationship. Being an ape doesn't diminish human uniqueness any more than being a mammal or a vertebrate does. It simply places us within the context of the natural world. Scientists classify humans within the family Hominidae, which includes all the great apes. Within this family, humans belong to the subfamily Hominidae, along with chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. And within that subfamily, humans and our extinct ancestors form the tribe Hominidae, whose members are called Hominins. These nested categories reflect the branching pattern of evolution, with each split representing a point in the distant past when populations diverged and began following separate evolutionary paths. Studying living primates has taught us invaluable lessons about what features are ancient inheritances and what features are uniquely human. When we observe a chimpanzee using a stick to extract termites from a mound, we're seeing evidence that tool use didn't originate with humans, but reaches deeper into our family tree. When we watch bonobos resolve conflicts through social bonding rather than violence, we're reminded that there are multiple ways to organize a society. When we note the cultural differences between different gorilla populations, we understand that the transmission of learned behaviors across generations isn't exclusively human. Yet we also see what makes humans distinctive within this family. Our mode of locomotion, Walking upright on two legs as our primary form of movement is unusual among primates. Our brains, particularly our cerebral cortex, have expanded dramatically. Our capacity for language, with its complex grammar and infinite expressiveness, surpasses any communication system in the animal kingdom. Our cultural achievements have transformed the planet itself. The primate family tree, with all its branches, represents millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. Some branches flourished, others withered, and a few gave rise to new radiations of forms. We humans exist at the tip of one particular branch, and to understand our specific story, we need to trace that branch backward through time, following it back toward the trunk where it diverged from the branch leading to our closest living relatives. This journey backward will take us into the forests of Africa, several million years ago, to a time when the ancestors of humans and chimpanzees were still one population, not yet divided by the forces of evolution. That pivotal moment of separation, and the creature that existed just before it occurred, is where our specifically human story truly begins. We've traced the long branches of the primate family tree, following them back through time as they grow closer together, merging at various points where different lineages shared common ancestors. Now we arrive at one of the most significant intersections in our story, a branch point that has fascinated scientists and the public alike for generations. This is where our path converges with that of our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, at a mysterious ancestor that lived somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago in the forests of Africa. This ancestor exists in a realm of scientific uncertainty, a creature we know must have existed, but whose physical remains we have not definitively identified. It represents one of those tantalizing gaps in the fossil record, a missing piece of the puzzle that researchers continue to search for with patience and determination. What we do know comes from careful detective work, piecing together clues from genetics, anatomy, and the fragmentary fossils that bracket this crucial time period. When we examine the DNA of modern humans and compare it with the DNA of chimpanzees, we find that we share approximately 98 to 99% of our genetic material. This remarkable similarity tells us that our evolutionary paths diverged relatively recently in geological terms. By measuring the differences in our DNA and calibrating this molecular clock with fossil evidence, scientists have estimated that this split occurred roughly 6 to 7 million years ago, though some estimates range slightly earlier or later. Imagine, if you will, the environment where this ancestor might have lived. Africa during this period was experiencing gradual but significant climate changes. The continent was slowly becoming drier, and the vast forests that had once stretched across much of equatorial Africa were beginning to fragment. In some areas, dense woodland remained, offering the shelter of trees and abundant fruit. In other regions, more open woodland and grassland were expanding, creating a mosaic landscape of different habitats existing side by side. Our last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos was almost certainly adapted to life in the trees. It would have been a skilled climber, moving through the forest canopy with a confidence born of millions of years of arboreal evolution. Its hands and feet would have been well suited for grasping branches, with curved fingers and toes that could wrap securely around tree limbs. Its shoulders and arms would have possessed the mobility needed for reaching fruit and moving between trees. Scientists believe this creature was likely similar in size to modern chimpanzees, perhaps weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms, with males probably being somewhat larger than females. Its body would have been covered in dark hair, providing protection from sun, rain, and the scratches inevitable in a life spent climbing through dense vegetation. Its face would have been relatively flat compared to many other mammals, with forward-facing eyes that provided the stereoscopic vision essential for judging distances when leaping between branches. The social life of this ancestor remains a subject of thoughtful speculation among researchers. Modern chimpanzees and bonobos share certain social characteristics with humans, such as living in complex groups with intricate social relationships, yet they differ from each other in significant ways. Chimpanzees live in communities characterized by male bonding and occasionally violent competition, while bonobos maintain more peaceful societies with strong female relationships. Humans display elements of both patterns, along with unique features of our own. This suggests that the last common ancestor may have had a flexible social system that contained the seeds of all these later variations. Diet would have been omnivorous and varied, taking advantage of whatever the forest provided. Ripe fruits would have been a favored food when available, their sweetness and energy-rich sugars providing essential calories. Young leaves, flowers, seeds, insects, and occasionally small animals would have supplemented this diet. The teeth of this ancestor would have reflected this varied menu, with molars capable of grinding plant materials and incisors for biting into fruits. One of the most intriguing questions about this last common ancestor concerns its mode of locomotion. While it was undoubtedly at home in the trees, exactly how it moved remains uncertain. Did it swing below branches using its arms like modern gibbons, walk along the tops of branches on all fours like many monkeys, or use some combination of methods? The answer matters because this would influence what anatomical starting point existed when the human lineage began its journey toward walking upright on the ground. Current thinking suggests that this ancestor likely moved on all fours when on the ground, using a form of locomotion called knuckle walking, where the animal walks on the soles of its feet and the knuckles of its hands. Both chimpanzees and gorillas move this way today, suggesting it may be an ancestral trait. However, some researchers have proposed alternative possibilities, and the truth is that we await fossil evidence to provide clarity. The brain of this last common ancestor was larger than that of most other mammals of comparable body size, reflecting the cognitive demands of primate life, navigating a three-dimensional forest environment, remembering the locations of fruit trees and when they bear fruit, managing complex social relationships, and perhaps using simple tools, all required considerable mental capacity. Yet this brain was still modest compared to what would come later in the human lineage. As we picture this creature moving through its African forest home, we're looking at the foundation from which two remarkable lineages would emerge. One path would lead to modern chimpanzees and bonobos, who remain superbly adapted to life in the forests of equatorial Africa. The other path, the one we follow in our story, would lead toward creatures who increasingly ventured from the trees to the ground, who would eventually walk upright across vast distances, whose brains would grow to unprecedented sizes, and who would one day contemplate the very evolutionary journey that created them. The precise moment of divergence, the exact circumstances that separated these two lineages, remains hidden in the deep past. Perhaps a population became isolated by geographic changes, preventing gene flow with other populations. Perhaps different groups simply began adapting to slightly different ecological niches, with these differences accumulating over countless generations until distinct lineages had emerged. What we can say with confidence is that somewhere in Africa, between 6 and 7 million years ago, our story as a distinct lineage began. The search continues for fossil evidence of this last common ancestor, and perhaps one day a fortunate paleontologist will uncover remains that illuminate this shadowy figure with greater clarity. Until then, we work with what we have, using every tool science provides to understand our origins as we prepare to meet the first members of the human family who appear in the fossil record. The forests of Africa, somewhere between 7 and 4 million years ago, were home to creatures whose existence we can only glimpse through the most fragmentary of evidence. These are the shadowy figures at the very threshold of our family story, beings who lived at the moment when our lineage began to diverge onto its own unique path. The fossils they left behind are rare and incomplete, yet each discovery has illuminated our understanding of what it means to be human. Imagine the challenge facing paleontologists who seek these ancient ancestors. They search in some of the most remote and rugged landscapes on Earth, guided by geological knowledge that tells them where rocks of the right age might be exposed. The fossils themselves are often nothing more than fragments, a piece of jawbone here, a few teeth there, perhaps a portion of skull. Yet from these sparse remains, scientists attempt to reconstruct entire species and understand their place in our evolutionary story. The earliest of these potential relatives is Sahelanthropus chadensis, whose remains were discovered in the Jurab Desert of Chad in 2001. The most significant find was a remarkably well-preserved cranium, nicknamed Tumai, which means hope of life in the local Goran language. This fossil dates to approximately 7 million years ago, placing it tantalizingly close to the time when our lineage and that of chimpanzees were diverging from their common ancestor. What makes Tumai particularly intriguing is the combination of features visible in that ancient skull. The face is relatively flat compared to modern apes, and the position of the foramen, magnum, the opening where the spinal cord enters the skull, suggests that this creature may have held its head atop its spine in a way more similar to upright walking beings than to knuckle walking apes. Yet the brain was small, about the size of a chimpanzee's brain, and other features remained quite ape-like. The teeth show an interesting mix too, with small canines more like those found in later hominins, rather than the large, sharp canines typical of apes. The debate surrounding Sahelanthropus centers on whether this creature truly walked upright, at least some of the time, or whether it remained primarily a tree dweller. Without limb bones, this question remains difficult to answer definitively. Some scientists argue that the skull features strongly suggest bipedal tendencies, while others remain cautious, noting that the evidence is not conclusive. What we can say is that Sahelanthropus represents a fascinating moment in time, a creature living at the very edge of when the human story began. Moving forward in time, though still in this misty early period, we encounter Orrorin tugenensis, discovered in the Tugen Hills of Kenya in 2000. Dating to about 6 million years ago, Orrorin is known from fragmentary remains including pieces of arm bones, thigh bones, a lower jaw, and teeth. The name Orrorin means original man in the local Tugen language, reflecting the discoverer's belief that this species was a direct ancestor of later humans. The most compelling evidence regarding Orrorin comes from the fossil thigh bones. These femurs show features that suggest their owner walked upright. The thickness of the bone in certain areas and the angle at which it would have connected to the hip indicate adaptations for bipedalism. Yet, like Sahelanthropus, Orrorin also retained features suited for climbing, suggesting these early relatives may have been comfortable both on the ground and in the trees. This makes perfect sense for creatures in transition, beings who were exploring new ways of moving through their world while retaining the abilities that had served their ancestors well. The teeth of Orrorin also tell an interesting story. The enamel is thick, an adaptation that would have been useful for eating hard or abrasive foods. The canine teeth are smaller than those of apes, another feature that aligns with what we see in later hominins. These dental clues hint at dietary patterns and perhaps social behaviors different from those of contemporary apes. As we move closer to 4 million years ago, we meet Ardipithecus, a genus that has provided more extensive fossil evidence and thus offers a clearer, though still incomplete, picture of these early relatives. 2 species of Ardipithecus have been identified: Ardipithecus cadabra, the older species dating to between 5.8 and 5.2 million years ago, and Ardipithecus ramidus, put to about 4.4 million years ago. Ardipithecus ramidus became world famous with the publication of detailed studies of a partial skeleton discovered in Ethiopia and nicknamed Ardi. This remarkable find included parts of the skull, hands, feet, and pelvis, providing unprecedented insight into how these early hominins moved and lived. The research, published in 2009 after years of painstaking analysis, revealed a creature that challenges many assumptions about what the earliest members of our family tree were like. Ardi lived in woodland environments, not the open grasslands that would come to play such an important role in later human evolution. She was capable of walking upright on the ground, as evidenced by the structure of her pelvis and the way her foot was built. However, her feet retained a grasping big toe, useful for climbing trees. Her hands were adapted for careful movement along branches, rather than for knuckle walking like modern chimpanzees and gorillas. This suggests that knuckle walking evolved independently in African apes after our lineage had already split away, a reminder that evolution does not follow a straight line from primitive to advanced, but rather branches in many directions. The picture that emerges from these earliest fossils is one of experimentation and adaptation. These creatures were not simply apes learning to walk upright, nor were they humans with some leftover ape features. They were their own unique beings, adapted to their specific environments and ways of life. They moved through forests and woodlands in ways that blended arboreal skills with increasing terrestrial mobility. They ate varied diets that likely included fruits, leaves, and other plant materials. They lived in social groups, though we can only speculate about the nature of their social interactions. The fossil record from this period remains frustratingly sparse. Each new discovery is treasured because the conditions required for fossilization are so particular, and the passage of millions of years erases most traces of life. Yet each fragment adds to our understanding, helping us glimpse the distant beginnings of our journey as a family separate from other apes. These earliest hominins, walking through African forests millions of years ago, represent the first tentative steps toward becoming human. Their story is written in scattered bones and teeth, in the rocks that hold these precious remains, and in the patient work of scientists who seek to understand our deepest origins. The forest floor stretched before our ancient ancestors, dappled with sunlight filtering through the canopy above, but something was changing in Africa between 7 and 4 million years ago. The climate was shifting, the forests were fragmenting, and in the growing spaces between the trees, a new way of moving through the world was taking shape. Walking upright on 2 legs, a seemingly simple change in posture, would transform everything about what it meant to be human. Imagine the enormous complexity involved in something we do without thinking every single day. When you stand and walk across a room, you're performing an extraordinary balancing act that required millions of years to perfect. Your spine curves in a gentle S-shape, distributing weight efficiently. Your pelvis has shortened and broadened into a basin shape, completely different from the elongated pelvis of a chimpanzee. Your leg bones angle inward from hip to knee, bringing your feet closer together beneath your center of gravity. Your feet themselves have become unique platforms, with a distinctive arch that acts as a spring, and a big toe that aligns with the others rather than jutting out to the side for grasping branches. Each of these changes involved modifications to bones, muscles, ligaments, and the nervous system. The foramen magnum, the hole in the skull where the spine enters, gradually moved from the back of the skull toward the bottom, balancing the head atop the spine like a ball on a seal's nose. The inner ear developed new structures to help maintain balance in this precarious upright position. The gluteus maximus muscle, relatively small in apes who walk on all fours, became the largest muscle in the human body, providing the power to extend the hip and keep us from pitching forward with each step. These transformations didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen without cost. Walking upright made childbirth more difficult, as the birth canal had to pass through a pelvis that was now supporting the entire weight of the upper body. It made us slower in short sprints compared to 4-legged animals. It exposed vulnerable organs that had been protected beneath the rib cage. So why did our ancestors persist with this unusual way of moving? The advantages, as it turned out, were numerous and profound. Standing upright meant that early hominins exposed less of their body surface to the intense midday sun. In the increasingly open environments of ancient Africa, this was no small benefit. With only the top of the head and shoulders in direct sunlight, and the rest of the body elevated above the ground where temperatures were lower, our ancestors could remain active during the hottest parts of the day, when many predators rested in the shade. Bipedalism also transformed breathing. When moving on all fours, breathing is tied to the rhythm of locomotion. Each stride compresses the chest cavity in a predictable pattern, but standing upright freed the breath from the constraints of movement. Our ancestors could breathe independently of their gait, could take quick, shallow breaths or slow, deep ones, could hold their breath or pant rapidly. This flexibility would later prove crucial for the development of speech, though that innovation lay far in the future. Walking on 2 legs freed the hands from the work of locomotion. Suddenly, those grasping appendages that had evolved for climbing and feeding in trees could be used while traveling. An early hominin could carry food back to a safe location, rather than eating it where it was found. They could carry infants more efficiently, allowing youngsters to be born less mature, and therefore with smaller heads that fit more easily through the birth canal. They could transport stones for tools, or tools themselves, or containers for water. The hands became available for gesturing, for social grooming, for throwing objects, for manipulating the environment in ways that would have been impossible on all fours. There was another, perhaps less obvious advantage. Standing upright made our ancestors taller. On the African savanna, where grasses grew and visibility could be limited, an upright posture meant being able to see farther across the landscape. Predators could be spotted at greater distances. Food sources became visible from farther away. Other members of the group could be kept in sight more easily. In a world where information meant survival, the ability to see over the grass could make the difference between life and death. But bipedalism wasn't just about immediate practical advantages. It changed the entire trajectory of human evolution in ways that wouldn't become apparent for millions of years. Walking efficiently on two legs required a different kind of brain than moving on all fours. The neural circuitry for balance, coordination, and spatial awareness had to be rewired. Some researchers believe that these changes in the brain, driven by the demands of bipedal walking, created the neurological foundation that would later allow for even more complex cognitive abilities. The fossil evidence shows us that bipedalism evolved gradually. The earliest hominins we met in the previous chapter showed a mixture of features, some suited for upright walking and others still adapted for climbing in trees. They were experimenting, in a sense, with different solutions to the problem of how to move through a changing world. Some species invested more heavily in adaptations for walking, while others retained more of their tree-climbing abilities. The environments of ancient Africa were diverse, and different strategies worked in different places. What's particularly fascinating is that bipedalism evolved before many of the other features we associate with being human. Our ancestors were walking upright millions of years before they had large brains. They walked upright long before they made sophisticated tools. They walked upright before they had language, before they had culture as we would recognize it, before they left Africa. In many ways, walking upright was the first chapter in the human story, the adaptation that made all the others possible. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the miracle of your own skeleton, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Every curve of your spine, every angle of your hip, every arch in your foot carries the history of those ancient experiments in upright walking. The ability to stand and walk that you take for granted represents one of the most significant transitions in the history of life on Earth, and with their hands freed and their eyes raised to scan the horizon, our early ancestors were ready for the next chapters in their extraordinary journey. As the sun rose over the Afar region of Ethiopia on that November morning in 1974, paleontologist Donald Johanson and graduate student Tom Gray set out across the harsh, ancient landscape, their eyes scanning the ground for any trace of our distant past. The afternoon heat was building, and they had been walking for hours when Johanson spotted something that made him pause. There, eroding from a gully, was a fragment of an arm bone. Then he saw another bone, and another. What they had stumbled upon would become the most famous fossil discovery of the 20th century, a skeleton that would capture the world's imagination and transform our understanding of human evolution. That evening, as the team celebrated their extraordinary find, someone played the Beatles song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" on a tape recorder. The name stuck. Lucy became the face of our ancient past, a small-bodied female who walked the Earth 3.2 million years ago. When her bones were carefully excavated and assembled, they represented about 40% of a complete skeleton, an unprecedented treasure in the world of paleoanthropology, where discoveries often consist of fragments and pieces scattered across time. Lucy stood only about 3.5 feet tall and weighed perhaps 60 pounds. Her scientific name, Australopithecus afarensis, identifies her as a southern ape from the Afar region. But Lucy was far more than an ape. When scientists examined her pelvis and leg bones, they found unmistakable evidence that she walked upright on two legs. Her knee joint angled inward, just as ours does, allowing her to balance her body weight over one leg while walking. Her pelvis was short and broad, adapted for bipedal locomotion. The place where her spine entered her skull was positioned underneath, indicating an upright posture rather than the forward-leaning position of knuckle-walking apes. Yet, Lucy retained many features that spoke to a life still connected to the trees. Her arms were relatively long compared to her legs. Her fingers were curved, well suited for grasping branches. Her shoulder joints suggested she was an excellent climber. Scientists debate whether Lucy and her kind slept in trees for safety, retreated to the branches when threatened, or foraged for food in the canopy. Perhaps they did all of these things, moving between two worlds, equally at home on the ground and in the trees. Lucy was not alone. In the years following her discovery, scientists found remains of more than 300 individuals belonging to Australopithecus afarensis, making it one of the best-known early human ancestors. These discoveries came from sites in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, spanning a time period from about 4 million to 3 million years ago. One particularly remarkable find, discovered at a site called Hadar in Ethiopia, contained the remains of at least 13 individuals who died together, possibly in a flash flood. This group, nicknamed the First Family, included adults and juveniles, providing invaluable insights into the variation within this ancient species. The landscape where Lucy and her relatives lived was quite different from the dry, desolate terrain where her bones were eventually found. 3 million years ago, this region of East Africa was a mosaic of environments. There were open grasslands dotted with trees, gallery forests along rivers and streams, and shallow lakes that expanded and contracted with the seasons. The climate was generally warmer and more humid than today, though it was becoming progressively drier as the African continent continued its long-term cooling and drying trend. In this diverse landscape, Australopithecus afarensis found a variety of foods to sustain themselves. Analysis of their teeth reveals wear patterns consistent with eating fruits, leaves, seeds, and other plant materials. Their molars were larger and thicker than ours, capable of processing tougher vegetation. They likely supplemented their diet with insects, bird eggs, and perhaps small animals when the opportunity arose, though their teeth suggest plant foods dominated their menu. Lucy and her kind were not the only Australopithecines roaming Africa during this era. In South Africa, different species were evolving along their own paths. Australopithecus africanus, discovered decades before Lucy in limestone caves, lived between 3 and 2 million years ago. Though similar in many ways to Australopithecus afarensis, this southern species showed its own distinctive features, including a slightly larger brain and different facial proportions. The discovery of the Tong child in 1924, the first Australopithecine ever found, had initially been met with skepticism by the scientific community. It took decades and many more discoveries before the significance of these African fossils was fully recognized. In the Lake Turkana region of Kenya, another species, Australopithecus anamensis, predated Lucy by hundreds of thousands of years, living between 4.2 and 3.9 million years ago. These even earlier Australopithecines showed that bipedalism was already well established in our family tree. Their shin bones and other leg fragments clearly indicated upright walking, pushing back the timeline of this crucial adaptation even further into the past. The world these creatures inhabited was shared with a diverse array of animals. Elephants and their extinct relatives browsed the vegetation. Various species of pigs rooted in the underbrush. Antelope grazed the grasslands. Hippos wallowed in rivers and lakes. And there were predators. Many predators, saber-toothed cats, stalked the landscape. Hyenas scavenged and hunted in packs. Large crocodiles lurked in the waterways. For a small bipedal primate like Lucy, danger was never far away. Some scientists believe that one of Lucy's relatives, a child who died about 3 million years ago, fell victim to an eagle based on distinctive marks on the skull matching the talons of large raptors. The Australopithecines had no tools, at least none that have been preserved in the archaeological record. They had brains only slightly larger than chimpanzees, averaging around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, yet they represent a crucial chapter in our story, a bridge between the tree-dwelling apes of the Miocene forests and the tool-making humans who would emerge later. They show us that walking upright came first, millions of years before the dramatic expansion of the brain, before stone tools, before the controlled use of fire. Lucy herself likely died near water, perhaps in a flood, and her body was quickly buried in sediment. This rapid burial preserved her bones, protecting them from scavengers and the weathering forces that destroy most remains. For over 3 million years, she lay entombed in the Ethiopian earth, while the world above her changed in ways she could never have imagined. Continents shifted, ice ages came and went, species rose and fell, and eventually, creatures with vastly larger brains and complex technology, her distant descendants, returned to that ancient landscape and found her waiting, a messenger from the deep past, telling us where we came from and how our journey began. As the African landscape continued its slow transformation between 2 and 1 million years ago, a remarkable group of hominins emerged alongside the gracile Australopithecines we've already encountered. These were the robust Australopithecines, members of the genus Paranthropus, and they represented a fascinating evolutionary experiment in survival through specialization. Picture the changing woodlands and savannas of eastern and southern Africa during this period. The climate was becoming more variable, with longer dry seasons and expanding grasslands. In response to these environmental pressures, one branch of the hominin family tree developed in a direction quite different from the lineage that would eventually lead to us. These were powerfully built creatures with distinctive anatomical features that set them apart from their relatives. The first of these robust cousins to appear in the fossil record was Paranthropus ethiopicus, known primarily from a spectacular skull discovered in Kenya in 1985. This skull, catalogued as KNMWT 17000, but affectionately known as the Black Skull due to its dark coloration from mineral staining, dates back approximately 2.5 million years, with its prominent sagittal crest running along the top of the skull like a bony mohawk. This individual provides a window into the early stages of robust Australopithecine evolution. The sagittal crest itself tells a story. This ridge of bone served as an anchor point for massive temporalis muscles, the muscles used for chewing. When you imagine the musculature that would have attached to such a crest, you begin to understand that these were creatures built for powerful, repetitive chewing. Their entire skull architecture seemed designed around the mechanics of processing tough, challenging foods. Moving forward in time, we encounter Paranthropus robustus, known primarily from sites in South Africa dating between 2 million and 1 million years ago. The Swartkrans cave system has yielded numerous fossils of this species, providing paleontologists with a rich understanding of their physical characteristics. These individuals possessed massive cheek teeth with thick enamel, perfect for grinding tough plant materials. Their molars were several times larger than those of modern humans, despite having overall similar body sizes. The face of Paranthropus robustus was distinctively flat and dish-shaped, with flaring cheekbones that accommodated the powerful chewing muscles. When reconstructed, these faces have an almost gentle appearance despite their robust construction, reminding us that these were peaceful plant eaters navigating their world with anatomical tools suited to their dietary niche. In Eastern Africa, Paranthropus boisei represented the most extreme expression of this robust pattern. Discovered by Mary Leakey in 1959 at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, the first specimen was initially nicknamed Nutcracker Man due to its enormous teeth and jaw structure. This species lived between approximately 2.3 and 1.2 million years ago, and their dental adaptation reached remarkable proportions. The molars of Paranthropus boisei were truly massive, with some individual teeth having chewing surfaces larger than several of your own teeth combined. The skull of Paranthropus boisei featured an even more pronounced sagittal crest than earlier robust forms, and in males, this crest could rise impressively high. The face was extremely flat, with the cheekbones positioned forward, creating ample room for the massive chewing apparatus. These anatomical features have led scientists to conclude that this species was consuming enormous quantities of tough, fibrous plant foods that required extensive processing. But what exactly were these powerful jaws processing? For decades, scientists assumed that the robust Australopithecines were cracking hard nuts and seeds, hence the nickname Nutcracker Man. However, modern techniques for analyzing fossil teeth have revealed a more nuanced story. Microscopic examination of tooth wear patterns and analysis of carbon isotopes preserved in tooth enamel suggest that Paranthropus boisei was actually consuming large quantities of grasses and sedges, plants that are tough and fibrous, but not necessarily hard. This dietary specialization represents both the strength and the vulnerability of the Paranthropus lineage. By adapting so successfully to processing specific types of vegetation, these species could exploit food resources that other animals found difficult to utilize. In stable environments, this specialization served them well, allowing them to thrive for over 1 million years. Yet specialization always carries risk. When environments change, specialists may find themselves unable to adapt quickly enough to new conditions. The robust Australopithecines were living alongside other members of the human family tree, including early members of our own genus Homo, who were developing a different survival strategy based on tool use, dietary flexibility, and expanding cognitive abilities. The landscape that these various hominins shared must have been a complex ecological theater. Paranthropus boisei, with their specialized chewing apparatus, would have spent considerable time processing vegetation. Evidence suggests they lived in social groups, and we can imagine them in the late afternoon light, sitting together in the relative safety of trees or rocky outcrops, their powerful jaws working steadily through fibrous plant materials. Despite their success over such a long span of time, the robust Australopithecines eventually vanished from the fossil record around 1 million years ago. The reasons for their extinction remain a topic of scientific investigation. Climate change continued to alter African landscapes, and the environments that had supported their specialized diet may have shifted or fragmented. Competition with other species, including early humans who were developing increasingly sophisticated tools and behaviors, may have played a role. It's important to remember that extinction is not failure in any meaningful sense. The Paranthropus lineage existed for well over 1 million years, successfully raising generations after generations of offspring, adapting to their environments, and carving out an ecological niche in the complex web of African life. Their evolutionary path simply led in a different direction than the one that would eventually produce modern humans. As we drift toward sleep tonight, we can reflect on these robust relatives and what they teach us about the nature of evolution itself. The human family tree was never a simple ladder leading inevitably to us. It was instead a branching bush, with different lineages exploring different adaptive strategies, each successful in its own time and place. The Paranthropus branch reminds us that multiple ways of being a hominin were possible, and that our own ancestors were simply one experiment among several occurring simultaneously in ancient Africa. As the robust Australopithecines pursued their specialized path through the changing landscapes of Africa, a different evolutionary experiment was unfolding alongside them. Around 2.5 million years ago, something remarkable happened in the fossil record. A new kind of creature appeared, one that would set the foundation for all humans to come, including ourselves. This was the dawn of the genus Homo, our genus, and with it came a subtle but profound shift in the story of human evolution. The African climate during this period was continuing its long transformation. The forests that had once dominated the landscape were giving way to more open woodlands and grasslands. The world was becoming cooler and drier, and the creatures living in it had to adapt or face extinction. In this challenging environment, natural selection favored innovation, flexibility, and intelligence. The first members of our genus emerged as answers to these environmental pressures, though they would have seemed quite unfamiliar to us if we could meet them today. Among the earliest representatives of genus Homo were 2 species whose remains tell us fascinating stories despite their fragmentary nature. Homo habilis, whose name means handyman, lived between approximately 2.4 and 1.4 million years ago. Discovered initially in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania by the legendary fossil hunting team of Louis and Mary Leakey, Homo habilis represented something genuinely new. These creatures had larger brains than the Australopithecines, though still considerably smaller than our own. Their brain capacity ranged from about 500 to 800 cubic centimeters, compared to the 400 to 500 cubic centimeters typical of Australopithecines. Imagine these early humans moving through the African landscape with a slightly different posture than their predecessors. They still retained some features suited for climbing, suggesting they hadn't completely abandoned the trees, but their bodies showed clear adaptations for life spent primarily on the ground. Their hands were particularly interesting, with proportions that would have allowed them to manipulate objects with greater precision than earlier hominins. The thumb and fingers worked together in ways that enabled a firm grip, essential for the activities that would come to define their existence. Living alongside Homo habilis, and perhaps overlapping in time and space, was another species that scientists continue to debate and study. Homo rudolfensis, named after Lake Rudolph, now known as Lake Turkana in Kenya, had a somewhat larger brain and a flatter, broader face than Homo habilis. Some researchers wonder whether these two species are truly distinct, or whether they represent variations within a single diverse species. The fossil evidence remains sparse, with only a handful of specimens to guide our understanding, and each new discovery has the potential to reshape our interpretations. What truly set these early members of genus Homo apart was not just their anatomy, but their behavior. The geological layers that contain their fossils also contain something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth: deliberately manufactured stone tools. Simple by our standards, these artifacts represent a cognitive revolution. Someone had to envision the sharp edge hidden inside a rounded stone, then use another stone to strike it at precisely the right angle and force to create that edge. This required planning, understanding cause and effect, and the ability to hold a mental image of something that didn't yet exist. The bodies of these early Homo species reflected adaptations for a lifestyle that differed from the Australopithecines in important ways. Their teeth were smaller and their faces less projecting, suggesting a shift in diet. While they certainly still consumed plant foods, they were likely incorporating more meat and perhaps accessing bone marrow by using stone tools to crack open bones that larger predators had left behind. This dietary shift, made possible by tool use, may have provided the extra calories and nutrients needed to fuel their larger brains. Life for Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis would have been both challenging and filled with opportunity. They inhabited a world teeming with animal life, including massive herbivores and formidable predators, without the natural weapons of claws or fangs, and lacking the speed of the swift animals around them. These early humans relied on their wits and their tools. They were likely social creatures, living in groups that provided protection and enabled the sharing of knowledge and resources. The landscape they moved through was one of dramatic contrasts. Near the lakes and rivers of the East African Rift Valley, lush vegetation supported diverse wildlife. Further from water sources, the terrain opened into grasslands dotted with acacia trees. The seasonal rhythms would have been pronounced, with wet periods bringing abundance and dry seasons demanding ingenuity and resilience. These environmental fluctuations may have been precisely the stimulus needed to favor bigger brains and greater behavioral flexibility. As we consider these distant relatives, it's important to remember that they weren't simply primitive versions of us, stumbling clumsily toward an inevitable destination. They were successful species in their own right, adapted to their time and place, solving the challenges of survival with the tools and abilities available to them. Their success is evident in their persistence for hundreds of thousands of years, far longer than our own species has yet existed. The transition from Australopithecine to Homo wasn't a sudden leap, but rather a gradual shift visible in the fossil record. Some specimens are difficult to classify with certainty, showing mixtures of features that blur the boundaries between categories. This is exactly what we should expect from evolution, which works through subtle changes accumulating over countless generations, rather than through sudden transformations. The emergence of genus Homo represents a threshold moment in our story, though the creatures crossing that threshold couldn't have known they were doing anything special. They were simply living their lives, day by day, finding food, avoiding danger, caring for their young, and occasionally, when circumstances demanded, chipping a stone to make it more useful. Yet these seemingly small adaptations, the slightly larger brain, the more dexterous hand, the willingness to experiment with tools, these would prove to be the foundation upon which all subsequent human evolution would build. As these early members of our genus moved through their African homeland, They carried within them the potential for everything that would follow. The long journey toward modern humanity had entered a new phase, one characterized by increasing reliance on intelligence, technology, and adaptability, rather than physical specialization. As the early members of our genus emerged onto the African landscape, something remarkable began to happen. The hands that had grasped branches for millions of years started to grasp something else: stones, bones, and pieces of wood deliberately shaped for specific purposes. This relationship between hands, tools, and minds would become one of the defining characteristics of what it means to be human. Imagine, if you will, a lakeside in East Africa, about 2.5 million years ago. The morning sun glints off the water's surface, while early humans move along the shoreline. One of them picks up a stone, turning it over in capable hands. With another stone, they strike it deliberately, and a sharp flake chips away. This simple act, repeated countless times across millennia, left behind a trail of evidence that archaeologists would eventually call the Oldowan tool tradition, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where many examples were first discovered. These earliest stone tools appear deceptively simple to our modern eyes. They consist primarily of cores, the rounded stones from which flakes were struck, and the sharp flakes themselves. Yet creating even these basic implements required remarkable cognitive abilities. The toolmaker needed to envision the hidden shape within the stone, understand which rocks would fracture properly, and possess the hand-eye coordination to strike at precisely the right angle with controlled force. They needed to plan several steps ahead, understanding cause and effect in ways that went beyond anything their ancestors had demonstrated. The archaeological sites where these tools accumulated tell us something profound about early human behavior. At places like Ghana in Ethiopia, dating to about 2.6 million years ago, we find concentrations of stone tools alongside animal bones bearing cut marks. These marks, visible under microscopes, show unmistakably where stone edges sliced through flesh and scraped against bone. Early humans were processing animal carcasses, accessing nutrition that would have been difficult or impossible to obtain with teeth and fingernails alone. Whether these early toolmakers were hunting large animals or scavenging from the kills of other predators remains a matter of ongoing investigation. The evidence suggests that both strategies probably played important roles. Sharp stone flakes could slice through tough hide that would defeat bare hands. They could separate meat from bone efficiently, allowing early humans to quickly process a carcass and move away before larger, more dangerous scavengers arrived. In this way, tools expanded the dietary possibilities available to our ancestors. But tools did more than simply help our ancestors eat. They may have fundamentally altered the trajectory of human brain evolution. Creating stone tools required new neural pathways and cognitive capabilities. The toolmaker needed spatial reasoning, fine motor control, and the ability to learn complex techniques through observation and practice. Some researchers have suggested that the same brain regions involved in tool manufacture also play crucial roles in language processing, though this remains an area of active debate and research. As we examine the archaeological record moving forward in time, we can observe subtle improvements in tool-making techniques. While the basic Oldowan tradition remained remarkably stable for hundreds of thousands of years, the tools gradually became more refined. Flakes were struck more precisely. Cores were worked more systematically. This slow but steady improvement suggests that knowledge was being passed from one generation to the next, that young individuals were learning by watching skilled toolmakers and practicing until they too could produce effective implements. This transmission of learned knowledge across generations represents a form of culture, though certainly simpler than what would come later in human history. Unlike genetic information that passes automatically from parent to offspring, technological knowledge must be actively taught and learned. A young human watching an experienced toolmaker had to pay attention, remember the sequence of actions, and practice repeatedly to develop the necessary skills. This created a new evolutionary dynamic where information could accumulate across generations in ways that went beyond biological inheritance. The relationship between tool use and brain expansion in early humans fascinates researchers. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive, requiring enormous amounts of energy to grow and maintain. For natural selection to favor larger brains, there must have been significant advantages that outweighed these costs. Tools may have provided one such advantage, offering access to more nutritious foods, while simultaneously creating selection pressure for the cognitive abilities needed to manufacture and use them effectively. When we examine the skulls of early Homo species, we find brain sizes that had increased beyond those of the Australopithecines, though still considerably smaller than modern human brains. A Homo habilis brain measured perhaps 600 to 700 cubic centimeters, compared to about 450 for Australopithecines and 1300 to 1400 for modern humans. This expansion wasn't uniform across all brain regions. Areas involved in hand coordination, planning, and social cognition showed particular development, suggesting specific selection pressures related to tool use and group living. Archaeological sites from this period also provide glimpses into the social dimensions of early human life. At some locations, we find evidence that tool-making materials were carried from their source areas to other places where they were worked and used. This suggests planning and foresight, the ability to anticipate future needs and act accordingly. It hints at mental time travel, the capacity to imagine scenarios that haven't happened yet and prepare for them. The landscape of East Africa during this period was changing, becoming gradually drier and more open. Forests gave way to woodlands and grasslands. In this shifting environment, the cognitive flexibility enabled by larger brains and enhanced by tool use would have provided crucial advantages. Early humans who could innovate, who could see new possibilities in their surroundings and act on them, were better equipped to survive and pass their genes to the next generation. As night settles over our imagined lakeside camp, those early toolmakers rest, their stone implements close at hand. They couldn't have known that they were participants in a revolution that would eventually lead their descendants to reshape the entire planet. They were simply solving the immediate problems of survival, using the remarkable cognitive abilities that evolution had given them. Yet in doing so, they crossed a threshold. They became creatures who didn't merely adapt to their environment, but who began, however humbly, to adapt their environment to themselves. The story of tools and brains would continue to unfold across the ages, with each innovation building upon what came before, until humans would develop technologies of almost unimaginable sophistication. But it all began here, with simple stones deliberately struck to create sharp edges, and with minds capable of imagining possibilities hidden within the raw materials of the natural world. The tools we explored in our previous journey were remarkable achievements, but they were only the beginning. The early members of our genus Homo, with their Oldowan stone flakes and choppers, had taken humanity's first steps toward technological thinking. Now, as we move forward in time to approximately 1.9 million years ago, a new character emerges on the stage of human evolution, one whose influence would reshape the entire story of our species. Imagine the African landscape during this period, a world of expanding grasslands and scattered woodlands, where the climate continued its slow dance between wet and dry phases. Into this world came Homo erectus, a human ancestor whose very name means upright man. Though the name might seem odd to us now, given that earlier hominins also walked upright, it reflected the wonder of the scientists who first encountered these fossils and recognized something fundamentally different about their posture and proportions. When you look at a reconstruction of Homo erectus, something immediately feels familiar. For the first time in our story, we encounter a human ancestor whose body proportions closely resemble our own, gone were the relatively short legs and long arms that characterized the Australopithecines. Homo erectus stood tall, with long legs built for striding across open ground, shorter arms, and a body shape that would not look entirely out of place if dressed in modern clothing, and glimpsed from a distance. Adults typically stood between 5 and 6 feet tall, with males generally larger than females, a pattern we still see in humans today. The skull of Homo erectus tells its own fascinating story. The brain case was larger than that of Homo habilis, housing a brain that averaged about 900 to 1,000 cubic centimeters, roughly 2/3 the size of a modern human brain. Above the eyes, prominent brow ridges gave the face a distinctive appearance, while the skull itself was long and low, quite different from the high, rounded skull we carry today. The face projected forward more than ours does, and the jaw was robust, built for powerful chewing, though smaller and less massive than those of the Australopithecines. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Homo erectus was not any single anatomical feature, but rather the story of their success, written in the rocks and fossils scattered across 3 continents. This was a species built not just for survival, but for movement, for exploration, for adapting to new challenges. They would become the first members of our family tree to venture beyond the African cradle of humanity, spreading across vast distances to occupy territories from the southern tip of Africa to the islands of Indonesia, from the Mediterranean coast to northern China. The story of Homo erectus begins in East Africa, where the earliest fossils have been discovered in layers of earth dating back about 1.9 million years. One of the most complete skeletons ever found comes from the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya, discovered in 1984. Known as the Turkana boy, or Nariokotome boy, this skeleton belonged to a young male who died around 1.5 million years ago, when he was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. Despite his youth, he already stood about 5 feet tall, and scientists estimate he would have reached well over 6 feet had he survived to adulthood. The completeness of this skeleton has provided invaluable insights into the anatomy and growth patterns of Homo erectus. With their long legs and efficient bipedal locomotion, Homo erectus was built for covering distance. Their body proportions suggest adaptation to hot, open environments, with a linear build that would have helped dissipate heat as they moved across the African savanna. Some researchers believe they may have been the first hominins to lose most of their body hair, relying instead on sweating to regulate body temperature, an adaptation that becomes particularly useful when pursuing prey over long distances under the African sun. But Homo erectus brought more than just new anatomy to the world. They were sophisticated tool makers, the creators of what archaeologists call the Acheulean tool tradition, named after the French site of Sainte-Achule, where such tools were first identified. These tools represented a significant advance over the simple Oldowan flakes of earlier times. The signature tool of the Acheulean tradition is the hand axe, a teardrop-shaped implement carefully crafted by removing flakes from both sides of a stone core. Unlike the opportunistic flaking of Oldowan tools, these hand axes required planning, skill, and a clear mental image of the desired final form. These hand axes, some fitting comfortably in the palm and others as long as a forearm, were remarkably standardized in their design across vast distances and enormous stretches of time. For over 1 million years, Homo erectus populations would continue making these tools in essentially the same form, a testament to both the effectiveness of the design and the strength of learned traditions. They were versatile implements, useful for butchering animals, working wood, digging for roots, and countless other tasks that we can only imagine. The longevity of Homo erectus as a species is truly breathtaking when we pause to consider it. While most mammal species exist for perhaps 1 million years before going extinct or evolving into something new, Homo erectus persisted for nearly 2 million years, surviving dramatic changes in climate and environment. During their long tenure on Earth, ice ages came and went, sea levels rose and fell, and countless other species appeared and disappeared, yet Homo erectus endured. Different populations of Homo erectus developed their own regional characteristics as they spread across Africa and Asia. In Java, Eugene Dubois discovered fossils in the 1890s that he called Pithecanthropus erectus, or upright ape man, though later scientists would recognize these remains as belonging to the same species found in Africa. In China, fossils from Zhoukoudian near Beijing, once known as Peking man, revealed populations that lived in caves and may have used fire, though the evidence for controlled fire use remains debated among researchers. Some scientists prefer to classify different populations as separate species, calling the African forms Homo ergaster and reserving Homo erectus for the Asian populations. Others see these differences as variations within a single, widespread and variable species. Such debates remind us that the lines we draw around species, particularly ancient ones known only from fragmentary fossils, are often judgments we make with incomplete information, attempts to categorize a continuous evolutionary process that doesn't naturally fall into neat boxes. As we rest here in our exploration, contemplating the success and resilience of Homo erectus, we can appreciate them as true pioneers, the first humans to look beyond familiar horizons and venture into unknown lands. Their anatomical adaptations, their technological skills, and their behavioral flexibility laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. The journey beyond Africa that they began would eventually lead humanity to every corner of the earth. But that expansion is a story for our next steps together. For now, let us simply marvel at these wanderers, these survivors, these distant ancestors who took humanity's first great journey beyond the African homeland, where our story began. As the long reign of Homo erectus continued, spanning across hundreds of thousands of years, something remarkable was happening. These upright walkers with their larger brains and more sophisticated tools were becoming restless. The African landscape that had nurtured their evolution was no longer the sole boundary of their world. Around 1.8 million years ago, perhaps earlier, some groups began to venture beyond the familiar horizons of their ancestral home, embarking on journeys that would carry human presence to distant corners of the ancient world. The first great exodus from Africa was not a single, purposeful migration. Rather, imagine it as a slow drift, generation after generation, as small bands of Homo erectus followed the rhythms of animal herds and the changing availability of water and plant resources. These movements were gradual, perhaps advancing only a few kilometers in a lifetime, yet over thousands of years, they accumulated into journeys of astonishing distance. The pathways out of Africa led primarily through the northeastern corner of the continent, where the Sinai Peninsula and the lands around the Red Sea provided natural bridges into the vast expanses of Asia. The climate during this period fluctuated between wetter and drier phases, and during the more favorable times, grasslands and woodlands would have extended across regions that today seem inhospitable. These green corridors, appearing and disappearing with the cycles of ice ages and warmer periods, created opportunities for movement that would otherwise have been impossible. One of the most remarkable discoveries documenting this early dispersal comes from the site of Dmanisi in the modern country of Georgia, nestled in the Caucasus region, where Europe meets Asia. Here, in the year 1991, archaeologists began uncovering a treasure trove of early human remains, dating to approximately 1.8 million years ago. The fossils from Dmanisi revealed something unexpected. These early travelers were more primitive in some ways than the classic Homo erectus specimens from Africa. They had smaller brains, and their skeletons showed a mixture of features, some quite ancient in appearance. What made the Dmanisi find so significant was their completeness and their variety. Here were individuals of different ages, including one elderly individual who had lost most of their teeth long before death, yet had somehow survived, suggesting that the group cared for its weaker members. The collection of skulls showed considerable variation, teaching scientists that early human populations were quite diverse in appearance, much like modern humans today. These Dmanisi people lived at the edge of a new frontier. The climate was cooler than the Africa they had left behind, presenting different challenges and requiring different solutions. Yet they persisted, crafting simple stone tools similar to the Oldowan tradition, hunting or scavenging small animals, and making their way in an unfamiliar world. The journey did not stop in the Caucasus. Other groups of Homo erectus, or perhaps waves of migrants following later, continued eastward across the vast breadth of Asia. On the tropical island of Java, part of the Indonesian archipelago, a Dutch physician named Eugene Dubois made a sensational discovery in the 1890s. Along the banks of the Solo River, he unearthed a skull cap and thigh bone that he proclaimed belonged to an ancient human ancestor. He called his find Pithecanthropus erectus, though we now know it as Homo erectus. The Java specimens, dating to around 1.5 million years ago, or possibly even earlier, demonstrated that early humans had reached Southeast Asia in remarkably ancient times. The presence of Homo erectus on Java, separated from the Asian mainland by ocean channels, raises fascinating questions. While sea levels were lower during glacial periods, exposing more land, some water crossings would still have been necessary. Whether these early humans possessed the cognitive abilities and technology to build simple rafts or boats, or whether they arrived on natural rafts of vegetation after storms, remains a mystery that stirs the imagination. Meanwhile, far to the north, evidence emerged from China that Homo erectus had also established populations in more temperate and even cold season environments. The famous site of Zhukudian, near modern Beijing, yielded fossils and artifacts spanning a long period, with the earliest remains possibly dating back 700,000 years or more. These northern populations, sometimes called Peking Man, showed that early humans could adapt to regions with harsh winters, though the evidence for controlled use of fire at these sites remains debated and will be explored in greater detail later in our story. What enabled these remarkable dispersals? Part of the answer lies in the body itself. Homo erectus possessed long, striding legs capable of covering considerable distances efficiently. Their larger brains allowed for more complex problem-solving and learning, helping them navigate unfamiliar territories and adapt to new food sources. Their sophisticated Acheulean hand axes, though not found at all early sites, represented a technological leap that made processing food and materials more efficient. But perhaps equally important was something less tangible: a certain behavioral flexibility, a willingness or ability to explore beyond the known, to try new foods, to modify strategies when old ones no longer worked. These cognitive and social capabilities, difficult to measure from fossils and stones alone, may have been the true key that unlocked the doors to new continents. As these pioneering populations spread across the Old World, they encountered environments dramatically different from the African savannas and woodlands that had shaped their ancestors. Bamboo forests in Asia, temperate woodlands in the Caucasus, tropical islands in Southeast Asia. Each region presented its own challenges and opportunities. In response, local populations may have begun developing their own distinctive characteristics, adaptations to their particular corners of the world. The journey out of Africa was not a single triumph, but an ongoing process, perhaps with multiple waves of migration over hundreds of thousands of years. Some populations may have thrived and expanded, while others dwindled or disappeared, leaving no descendants. The ancient world was a place of constant change, where rising and falling sea levels altered coastlines, where advancing and retreating ice sheets transformed landscapes, and where early humans persisted through adaptability and resilience. As we let this image settle into our minds, small bands of early humans walking ever forward into unknown lands, carrying with them the spark of consciousness and the simple tools of survival, we can appreciate the courage inherent in that ancient restlessness. They could not have known what lay beyond the next valley or across the next river, yet they went forward nonetheless, and in doing so, they began to transform our species from African creatures into citizens of the wider world. The early humans who ventured beyond Africa faced countless challenges in their new environments, but perhaps nothing transformed their existence quite as profoundly as their relationship with fire. Imagine the first time one of our ancestors noticed how lightning strikes could set the savanna ablaze, or how volcanic activity could ignite the landscape. Fire was initially something to fear, something to flee from, but gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, it became something else entirely: a tool, a companion, and ultimately, a fundamental part of what it meant to be human. The evidence for when humans first began to control fire remains one of the most debated topics in archaeology. Fire leaves traces, but these traces can be difficult to interpret after millennia have passed. Was the charred bone found at an ancient site the result of a wildfire, or did human hands carefully tend those flames? Did ash deposits accumulate naturally, or were they the remnants of a deliberate hearth? These questions challenge researchers as they sift through layers of earth and time. Some of the earliest possible evidence comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where archaeologists have found burnt bones and ash deposits dating back perhaps as far as 1 million years ago. The cave's deep interior, where natural fires would be unlikely to reach, suggests that someone carried fire inside and maintained it there. In the Swartkrans cave system, also in South Africa, burnt bones from about 1.5 million years ago show patterns that some researchers interpret as controlled burning, though others remain cautious about drawing definitive conclusions. Evidence becomes more substantial when we look at sites from around 400,000 years ago. At Quesem Cave in Israel, repeated hearths with systematic evidence of burning suggest that humans were regularly using fire in structured ways. Similar evidence appears at various sites across Europe and Asia from this period, indicating that by this time, fire use had become a consistent part of human behavior rather than an occasional accident or opportunistic scavenging of natural flames. The true mastery came with fire-making itself, the ability to create flames at will rather than merely maintaining fires that had been captured from natural sources. This breakthrough freed humans from the necessity of constantly guarding precious embers and carrying them from place to place. Learning to generate fire through striking stones together to create sparks, or rapidly rotating wooden sticks to generate heat through friction, required understanding, patience, and practice. These techniques gave humans independence and security in a way that captured fire never could. Consider what fire meant for those ancient communities gathering around its warmth as darkness fell. The flames pushed back the night, creating a circle of light and safety in a world full of dangers. Predators with powerful jaws and sharp claws, so confident in darkness, hesitated at the sight of fire. The warmth allowed humans to survive in colder climates, expanding the range of environments they could inhabit. During ice ages, when glaciers advanced and temperatures plummeted, fire made the difference between survival and extinction. But the impact of fire extended far beyond warmth and protection. Cooking food fundamentally altered human biology and society. Raw meat is tough and difficult to digest. Raw tubers and roots, while edible, require enormous amounts of chewing and yield limited nutrition. Fire transformed these foods, making them softer, more digestible, and releasing nutrients that would otherwise pass through the body unused. Meat that might have harbored dangerous parasites became safe to eat when cooked. Plants that contained toxic compounds became edible after exposure to heat, broke down their defensive chemicals. This change in diet had profound effects on human anatomy and evolution, with cooked food requiring less effort to chew and digest. The massive jaws and large teeth of earlier hominins became less necessary. Over generations, faces became smaller, teeth reduced in size, and digestive systems shortened. The energy that would have gone into maintaining large digestive organs could instead be diverted to other purposes. Some researchers suggest that the extra calories and improved nutrition from cooked food provided the energy surplus necessary to support larger, more energy-hungry brains. Around the fire, something else happened that may have been equally important. Flames became gathering places. After a long day of foraging, hunting, and traveling, the hearth offered a natural focal point where the community could come together. In that circle of light, people could see each other's faces clearly, could share food prepared together, could communicate and bond. Perhaps this is where stories began to flourish, where knowledge passed from older to younger generations, where the complex social relationships that characterize human societies deepened and evolved. Fire also opened new possibilities for tool-making and resource processing. Heating certain types of stone before striking them made the material easier to work and allowed for more refined tools. Fire could be used to harden the points of wooden spears, making them more effective weapons. In colder regions, humans could use fire to render fat from animals, creating fuel for lamps that extended light beyond the fire itself. Smoke from fires could be used to preserve meat, allowing food to be stored for longer periods. Archaeological sites from various periods show evidence of organized hearths, carefully constructed fire pits, and designated cooking areas. These features reveal planning and forethought, the establishment of specific spaces for specific purposes within living areas. At Terra Amata in France, dating to around 380,000 years ago, archaeologists found evidence of hut structures with hearths inside them, suggesting that by this time, fire had become an integral part of domestic space, controlled and contained within human dwellings. The management of fire required cooperation and shared responsibility. Keeping flames alive meant gathering fuel, maintaining the fire through the night, and ensuring it didn't spread dangerously. These tasks likely involved multiple members of a group, creating another layer of social organization and mutual dependence. Children might learn the skills of fire tending by watching and helping adults, absorbing not just practical knowledge but also cultural practices and rules about this powerful element. As our journey through human evolution continues, the mastery of fire stands as one of those pivotal achievements that separated our ancestors from other creatures. It was a threshold crossed, a line beyond which human life took on new dimensions of possibility. With fire, humans carried a piece of the sun's energy with them, bending the natural world to serve their needs in ways no other animal had done. The hearth became the heart of human community, and its warm light would guide our species through the long millennia ahead. The story of human evolution moves now through a landscape of transformation, a period when the human family tree branches in fascinating ways. As fire brought communities together and cooking changed bodies and minds, new forms of humans were emerging across Africa and beyond. Among these, one species stands out as particularly significant, a bridge between the older worlds of Homo erectus and the newer worlds of Neanderthals and modern humans. These were the people we now call Homo heidelbergensis, named after the German city near where their jawbone was first discovered in 1908. Picture Africa and Europe and parts of Western Asia between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago. The climate swings between warm periods and ice ages, demanding adaptability from any creature hoping to survive. In this challenging world, Homo heidelbergensis thrives, spreading across a vast geographic range that spans from the southern tip of Africa to the forests and plains of Europe. These humans represent something new, something different from their predecessors, yet they carry forward the legacy of nearly 2 million years of human evolution. The first fossil that would eventually be recognized as belonging to this species was found in the village of Mauer, near Heidelberg, in a sandpit where workers were extracting material for industrial use. The discovery was a robust lower jaw, surprisingly large and thick, with teeth that were distinctly human in their proportions. This Mauer mandible, as it came to be known, dated to approximately 600,000 years ago, and it presented anthropologists with a puzzle. Here was something that seemed to fall between the older Homo erectus and the more recent Neanderthals, a missing piece in the story of how humans evolved in Europe and Africa. As more fossils emerged from sites across the Old World, a picture began to form of what these people looked like and how they lived. Homo heidelbergensis individuals were powerfully built, with heavy bones and strong muscular attachments that speak to lives of physical exertion and strength. They stood as tall as modern humans, typically between 5.5 and 6 feet in height, with body proportions adapted to the climates where they lived. Their skulls show a fascinating mixture of features: faces that project forward more than ours do, prominent brow ridges that arch above the eyes, yet brain cases that are substantially larger than those of Homo erectus, approaching the size of modern human brains, with volumes ranging from 1,100 to 1,300 cubic centimeters. One of the most remarkable fossil sites for understanding these people is found in the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain, where a deep shaft called Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, has yielded the remains of at least 28 individuals, dating to around 400,000 years ago. The discovery of so many individuals in one place provides an unprecedented window into the anatomy and variation within a population of ancient humans. These bones reveal people who were already showing some features that would later characterize Neanderthals, suggesting that in Europe, Homo heidelbergensis was evolving in a particular direction, responding to the demands of Ice Age environments. In Africa, sites like Bodo in Ethiopia and Kabwe in Zambia preserve skulls that share many features with their European counterparts, but show their own distinctive characteristics. The African populations of Homo heidelbergensis appear to have followed a different evolutionary path, one that would eventually lead to the emergence of our own species, Homo sapiens. This geographic separation, with populations isolated by distance and climate, sets the stage for the divergence that produces multiple human species, each adapted to their particular corners of the world. The tools created by Homo heidelbergensis show sophistication and planning. They crafted refined hand axes and cleavers in the Herculean tradition, shaping stone with skill and purpose. At some sites, particularly in Europe, we begin to see evidence of wooden spears, including the remarkable discovery at Schöningen in Germany of 8 wooden throwing spears, perfectly preserved in ancient lake sediments and dating to approximately 300,000 years ago. These spears, made from spruce trunks with the hardest wood carefully positioned at the point, demonstrate not only technical skill, but also planning and understanding of materials. They were found alongside the butchered remains of horses, leaving little doubt about their purpose and effectiveness. The presence of such hunting weapons suggests that Homo heidelbergensis engaged in coordinated hunting of large animals, an activity that would require communication, cooperation, and strategic thinking. While we cannot know whether they possessed language as we understand it, the complexity of their behavior suggests increasingly sophisticated ways of sharing information and working together toward common goals. These humans also show the first possible evidence of caring for the dead in ways that might suggest symbolic thought or emotional bonds. The concentration of bodies in the Cima de los Huesos pit has puzzled researchers, as there is no sign that these people lived in the cave or that they fell in by accident. Some scientists propose that the bodies were deliberately placed there, perhaps representing an early form of burial practice, or at least some intentional treatment of deceased community members. If true, this would represent a profound development in human consciousness, a recognition of death that goes beyond simple survival instinct. The timeline of Homo heidelbergensis spans a critical period in Earth's climate history, encompassing multiple glacial and interglacial cycles. These populations had to adapt to dramatically changing environments, from warm periods when forests expanded across Europe to brutal ice ages, when glaciers advanced and survival demanded resourcefulness and resilience. Their success across such varied conditions and their wide geographic distribution testify to their adaptability and intelligence. As time passes and populations remain separated by geography and climate, Homo heidelbergensis begins to diverge into distinct lineages. In Europe and Western Asia, the populations evolve features that will eventually characterize the Neanderthals: more robust builds suited to cold climates, distinctive skull shapes, and specialized adaptations for life in Ice Age landscapes. In Africa, other populations of heidelbergensis take a different path, one that leads toward lighter bone structure, more gracile builds, and eventually the anatomy that we recognize as fully modern human. This species, then, represents a crucial branch point in our family tree, the last common ancestor shared by Neanderthals and modern humans. They are both our predecessors and the predecessors of our closest evolutionary cousins. In their story, we see how geographic separation and environmental pressures can take populations that begin as variations within a single species and transform them over hundreds of thousands of years into distinct species with their own unique characteristics and destinies. The stage is set for the emergence of the Neanderthals in the north and west, and for the birth of Homo sapiens in Africa, each inheriting the legacy of heidelbergensis and each facing the challenges of survival in a world of change. As the lineage of Homo heidelbergensis branched and diverged across different landscapes, populations separated by geography began to follow their own evolutionary paths. In the cold reaches of Europe and Western Asia, one branch adapted to an environment unlike anything their ancestors had known. These people would become our closest evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals, and their story is one of resilience, sophistication, and ultimate mystery. The first Neanderthal fossils were discovered in 1856 in a limestone cave in the Neander Valley of Germany, though at the time, no one quite knew what to make of them. The bones were thick and heavy, with prominent brow ridges and a skull shape that seemed distinctly different from modern humans. Some thought they were remains of a diseased person. Others imagined them to be ancient warriors or cave bears. It would take decades and many more discoveries before scientists recognized these fossils as evidence of another human species, one that had lived alongside our own ancestors for thousands of years. The Neanderthals emerged as a distinct population somewhere between 400,000 and 250,000 years ago, their features shaped by the harsh Ice Age climates of Europe and Western Asia. Their bodies were stocky and powerful, built close to the ground with shorter limbs than modern humans. This compact build was perfectly suited for conserving heat in frigid environments. Their barrel-shaped chests housed large lungs that could process the thin, cold air. Every aspect of their anatomy spoke to lives lived in challenging conditions, where survival required both physical strength and remarkable endurance. Their faces were distinctive, with large noses that likely helped warm cold air before it reached their lungs, prominent brow ridges that projected forward, and a skull that was long and low rather than high and rounded like ours. Their brains were actually slightly larger on average than those of modern humans, though shaped differently. This tells us that intelligence cannot be measured by brain size alone, and that different human species solved the challenges of survival in their own unique ways. The Neanderthals were masterful hunters, capable of taking down large game in landscapes where plant foods were often scarce during long winters. Archaeological sites across Europe reveal evidence of successful hunts for woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, bison, and reindeer. Close examination of Neanderthal skeletons shows patterns of injuries similar to those found in modern rodeo riders, suggesting they hunted large animals at extremely close range, a dangerous and courageous way to secure food. Their tools represented a significant advance over earlier traditions. The stone tools associated with Neanderthals, known as the Mousterian tool industry, required sophisticated planning and skill to create. They used a technique called Levallois knapping, which involved carefully preparing a stone core so that a finished tool could be struck off in a single blow. This wasn't random hammering at rocks. It required the ability to visualize the final product before it existed, to understand the properties of different types of stone, and to execute precise sequences of actions. But Neanderthals were more than hunters and toolmakers. Evidence suggests they cared for their sick and injured. Several Neanderthal skeletons show signs of serious injuries or illnesses that the individual survived for years after, suggesting that others in their group provided food and protection during recovery. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal man who lived to be relatively old had survived multiple injuries, including a blow to the head that likely left him partially blind. He could not have survived without help from his community. The question of Neanderthal culture and symbolic thinking has fascinated researchers for generations. Did they bury their dead deliberately? Some archaeological sites suggest they did, with bodies placed in intentional positions, though this remains debated. Did they create art or adorn themselves with jewelry? Recent discoveries have pushed back the dates for various symbolic behaviors, with evidence that some Neanderthals in Spain used pigments, collected eagle talons, possibly for necklaces, and even created simple geometric engravings in caves. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals thrived in their Ice Age world. They adapted to advancing and retreating glaciers, shifting climates, and changing landscapes. They passed knowledge from generation to generation, teaching their children where to find food, how to make tools, and how to survive in an unforgiving environment. They likely had language of some kind, though we cannot know what it sounded like. The structure of their throats and the presence of a gene associated with speech in modern humans suggest they could produce a range of sounds. Around 45,000 years ago, something changed. Modern humans, our direct ancestors Homo sapiens, began arriving in Europe in greater numbers, spreading through territories that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. For several thousand years, both species lived on the same continent, sometimes in nearby areas. What happened when they met? This question has captivated scientists and the public alike. We now know from ancient DNA analysis that the two groups didn't simply coexist separately. They met, they interacted, and they interbred. Most people of non-African descent today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genome, usually between 1 and 4%. This genetic legacy means that Neanderthals didn't truly go extinct. Part of them lives on in billions of people alive today. Some of the genes they passed on affect our immune systems, our skin and hair, and our responses to sunlight. By about 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations were declining. They persisted longest in scattered refuges, particularly in southern Spain and Gibraltar, where the last known Neanderthals lived, until perhaps 37,000 years ago. Why they disappeared remains one of the great questions of human evolution. Competition with modern humans likely played a role, but climate change, disease, and simply being absorbed into the larger population of incoming Homo sapiens may all have contributed. Perhaps there was no single dramatic cause, but rather a combination of factors that gradually reduced their numbers until they could no longer sustain viable populations. The Neanderthals remind us that our species was not alone for most of its existence. The human story is not a simple straight line, but a branching tree with many paths explored and many experiments in being human. The Neanderthals represented one remarkably successful way of being human, perfectly adapted to their world and capable of surviving challenges that would have defeated lesser creatures. Their disappearance leaves us as the only human species remaining, carrying forward not just our own legacy, but echoes of theirs as well, written in the very code of our DNA. As the Neanderthals continued their lives across the frost-touched valleys of Europe and the caves of Western Asia, something remarkable was happening far to the south, in the sun-warmed lands of Africa. A new kind of human was emerging, one whose story would eventually spread to every corner of the planet. This was Homo sapiens, our own species, and the story of our beginning is written in ancient bones scattered across the African continent. The deep past has a way of surprising us, and nowhere is this more true than in the search for our origins. For many years, scientists believed that modern humans emerged in East Africa around 200,000 years ago. The Homo remains from Ethiopia, dated to approximately 195,000 years ago, were long considered among the earliest evidence of our species. The famous Herto skulls, also from Ethiopia and dated to around 160,000 years ago, seem to confirm this picture. But then, in the warm light of a Moroccan morning, everything changed. At a site called Jebel Irhoud, nestled in the rolling landscape of Morocco, fossil hunters had been discovering human remains since the 1960s. These bones were puzzling, displaying a mixture of features that didn't quite fit the established timeline. Then, in the early 21st century, new excavations uncovered more remains, and new dating techniques were applied to the site. The results pushed back the dawn of our species dramatically. The Jebel Irhoud fossils were approximately 300,000 years old, possibly even slightly older. This discovery rewrote the opening chapter of the Homo sapiens story, suggesting that our species emerged much earlier than previously thought, and that this emergence may have involved populations spread across Africa, rather than a single location. The individuals from Jebel Irhoud show us something fascinating about our early form. Their faces would have looked remarkably modern to our eyes, with flatter profiles and smaller brow ridges than those of earlier humans. Their teeth were similar in size and shape to ours, yet their skulls were more elongated than ours, not yet possessing the high, rounded brain cases that characterize humans living today. They were us, but not quite us, standing at the threshold between what came before and what we would become. South Africa adds its own chapters to this story. The Floresbad skull, found near a natural spring, dates to around 260,000 years ago. At Klassie's river mouth, caves overlooking the Indian Ocean have yielded fragmentary remains from as early as 120,000 years ago. Each discovery adds texture to our understanding, suggesting that early Homo sapiens populations were living in different parts of Africa, adapting to diverse environments, from Mediterranean-like coastlands to inland regions. What made Homo sapiens distinctive? The answer lies partly in our anatomy. Our skeletons became more gracile, meaning lighter and less robust than those of earlier humans. Our skulls developed that characteristic rounded shape, housing brains that, while not necessarily larger than those of Neanderthals, were organized differently. The shape of our skull allowed for changes in brain structure that may have contributed to our particular cognitive strengths. Our faces became flatter, tucked beneath our foreheads rather than projecting forward. We developed chins, a curious anatomical feature that serves no clear practical purpose, but remains one of our defining characteristics. Our bodies became built for endurance rather than raw power, where Neanderthals had stocky, muscular frames adapted for strength and cold climates. Homo sapiens retained the tall, slender build, first seen in Homo erectus, well suited for covering long distances in warm environments. Our limb proportions, with relatively long legs, helped us regulate body temperature in the African heat. These physical differences, subtle as they might seem, had profound implications for how we lived, moved, and interacted with our world. But anatomy tells only part of the story. Something was happening inside those rounded skulls, something that would prove even more significant than our physical form. The minds of early Homo sapiens were developing capabilities that would eventually transform life on Earth. The full flowering of these capabilities would take time, emerging gradually over tens of thousands of years, but the foundation was being laid in these early African populations. The archaeological sites associated with early Homo sapiens show us glimpses of increasingly complex behavior. Stone tools were becoming more sophisticated, moving toward the production of blades and specialized implements. Evidence suggests that these early people were using pigments, perhaps for decoration or symbolic purposes, though the full meaning of such practices remains veiled in time. They were exploiting marine resources along the coasts, harvesting shellfish and perhaps fishing, demonstrating an ability to extract food from diverse environments. Life for these early members of our species was not easy. Africa during this period was experiencing dramatic climate fluctuations. Periods of lush, green landscapes alternated with harsh, arid conditions. Lakes expanded and contracted. Forests gave way to grasslands and back again. These environmental pressures may have played a role in shaping Homo sapiens, favoring adaptability, problem-solving, and the ability to modify behavior in response to changing circumstances. The populations that survived were those that could adjust, innovate, and find new solutions to the challenges of survival. The genetics of modern humans, studied through careful analysis of DNA from populations around the world, support this African origin story. All living humans share genetic ancestry that traces back to Africa between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. The greatest genetic diversity exists among African populations, which makes sense if humans lived there longest, and other populations descended from groups that later left the continent. We are, all of us, Africans in our deepest ancestry. Yet even as we identify Africa as the birthplace of Homo sapiens, we must remember that early human evolution was not a simple linear process. Different populations of early Homo sapiens likely lived semi-isolated from one another across the vast African landscape, occasionally interacting, exchanging genes and ideas, but also developing their own local adaptations. Our species emerged not in a single moment or place, but through a complex process spread across space and time, a gradual coalescence of features and behaviors that would eventually define humanity. As these early Homo sapiens populations lived their lives across Africa, hunting game, gathering plants, raising children, and adapting to their ever-changing environments, they could not have known the future that awaited their descendants. They could not have imagined that their lineage would one day spread across the entire world, that their kind would develop languages beyond counting, build cities that touched the sky, and even leave footprints on the moon. But the seeds of all that was to come were planted here, in the African earth, between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, when our species first opened its eyes to the world. The anatomically modern humans who emerged in Africa possessed something profoundly different from all the species that came before them. While they looked much like us, with their high foreheads and rounded skulls, the true transformation happening within these early Homo sapiens was invisible to the eye. Somewhere in the depths of their minds, a revolution was taking place, one that would forever separate our species from every other creature that had ever walked the earth. The archaeological record preserves tantalizing glimpses of this cognitive awakening. In a cave called Blombos along the southern coast of South Africa, researchers discovered small pieces of red ochre, dating back 75,000 years. These weren't just rocks. Someone had deliberately carved geometric patterns into their surfaces, creating cross-hatched designs with careful precision. The lines are perfectly parallel, meeting at right angles to form diamond shapes that repeat in regular patterns. This was not accidental. This was intentional creation, abstract design, symbolic representation. Someone was thinking in ways that transcended the immediate needs of survival. Red ochre appears throughout early human sites across Africa, sometimes ground into powder, sometimes shaped into crayons. Its significance lies not in its practical uses, though it could serve as adhesive or sunscreen, but in what it represents about the human mind. Red pigment requires effort to obtain and process. Using it for body decoration or artwork means investing time and energy into something that has no immediate survival value. It suggests these ancient humans were thinking about appearance, about identity, about making statements that others could understand. They were creating meaning. The famous cave paintings of Europe capture our imagination most vividly, perhaps because of their breathtaking artistry and remarkable preservation. In the depths of Chauvet Cave in southern France, images created over 30,000 years ago still glow on the stone walls. Horses gallop in fluid motion, their muscular bodies rendered with confident sweeping lines. Lions prowl with menacing intensity, their faces shown in perspective that suggests genuine artistic sophistication. Rhinoceroses charge across the rock face, and herds of aurochs, those massive wild cattle now extinct, thunder through limestone galleries. These weren't crude stick figures or simple outlines. The artists who created them understood shading and proportion. They used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their animals three-dimensional form, making a protruding rock become the muscular shoulder of a bison. They mixed pigments from charcoal, ochre, and minerals, creating blacks and reds and browns. They may have used hollow bones or reeds to blow paint onto the walls, creating the earliest known airbrushing. Some images were created by artists standing on scaffolding or ladders to reach high surfaces, suggesting planning and communal effort. The location of these paintings is itself meaningful. These images weren't created in the comfortable living areas near cave entrances where people spent their daily lives. They were placed deep underground, in chambers that required dangerous journeys through narrow passages and total darkness. People had to bring light sources, torches, or stone lamps filled with animal fat to venture into these depths. The very difficulty of reaching these spaces suggests they held special significance, perhaps sacred or ceremonial importance. These were deliberate destinations for deliberate purposes, from the limestone shelters of France and Spain to similar sites scattered across the world. We find evidence of humans creating art. Handprints appear on cave walls, made by placing a palm against the stone and blowing pigment around it, leaving a negative image. Sometimes these hands have missing fingers, leading to endless speculation about whether injuries or ritual amputations or some form of communication was being recorded. In some caves, hundreds of handprints cluster together, tangible evidence that people wanted to say, "I was here, I existed, remember me." Small carved figurines appear in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago. The famous Venus figurines found across Europe depict female forms with exaggerated features, carved from ivory, stone, or clay. These palm-sized figures show remarkable craftsmanship. Creating them required skill, time, and vision, the ability to see a shape within a piece of mammoth tusk and patiently chip away everything that wasn't part of that vision. Some figurines clearly represent humans, while others blend human and animal features, perhaps representing supernatural beings or shamanic transformations. Personal ornament tells a similar story of minds that thought symbolically. Beads crafted from shells, teeth, ivory, and stone appear at numerous sites. These tiny objects, each requiring considerable effort to make, drilling holes through hard material with stone tools, demands patience and skill, were strung together into necklaces or sewn onto clothing. Like ochre decoration and cave paintings, such ornaments serve no survival function. They exist purely to convey meaning, perhaps indicating status, group membership, personal achievement, or spiritual beliefs. The most invisible yet most significant development of this period was almost certainly language. While languages leave no fossil record, and we can never know exactly when or how human speech developed its full complexity, the archaeological evidence of symbolic behavior strongly suggests sophisticated communication. Creating complex art, manufacturing elaborate tools, and successfully coordinating group activities all benefit enormously from detailed verbal communication. The ability to share knowledge, tell stories, plan future actions, and discuss abstract concepts would have provided tremendous advantages. Language allows humans to do something unique. We can share detailed information about things that aren't present. We can describe events from the past, plan for the future, discuss hypothetical situations, and explain abstract ideas. We can accumulate and transmit cultural knowledge across generations without each person needing to learn everything through personal experience. A young hunter can learn about animal behavior, dangerous plants, and distant water sources through stories before ever encountering them directly. This makes language perhaps the most powerful survival tool our species ever developed. The anatomical prerequisites for speech were likely in place long before the cultural explosion of art and symbolism. The position of the hyoid bone in the throat, the descended larynx that creates space for diverse sounds, and the neural control required for the rapid, precise movements of tongue and lips. These physical features probably evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, but possessing the hardware for speech doesn't automatically create language. That requires a cognitive leap, a mental capacity for abstract thought, symbolic representation, and grammatical structure. Music may have emerged alongside, or even before complex language. Bone flutes dating back 40,000 years have been found in European caves, carefully crafted instruments with precisely drilled holes that could produce different notes. The musicality suggests not just the creation of sound, but the appreciation of melody, rhythm, and perhaps social bonding through shared experience. Imagine those ancient people gathering in firelight, the haunting notes of a bone flute echoing from stone walls, voices joining in songs whose words and melodies are lost to time, but whose existence speaks to something deeply human. As Homo sapiens developed these cognitive abilities, they possessed not just physical tools, but mental tools of unprecedented power. They could imagine, plan, create, communicate, and cooperate in ways no previous species had achieved. The world was about to change because humans carrying these abilities were preparing to spread across the entire planet, adapting to every environment, and eventually transforming not just themselves, but the entire Earth. The fires of creativity had been lit. Our ancestors had painted their dreams on cave walls, carved stories into ivory and stone, adorned themselves with shells and ochre, and buried their dead with ceremony and care. The human mind had awakened to itself, capable of wondering about the past and imagining the future. But the story of Homo sapiens in Africa, remarkable as it was, represents only the beginning of something far more extraordinary. For our species was about to embark on a journey that would carry human footprints to every corner of the Earth. The timing of this great dispersal has been debated and refined as new evidence emerges, but the genetic signatures carried in the cells of people living today tell a consistent story. Somewhere between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, a relatively small group of modern humans left their African homeland and ventured into lands their ancestors had never seen. This wasn't the first time human feet had walked beyond Africa's borders, of course. Homo erectus had made that journey nearly 2 million years earlier, and their descendants had spread across much of the ancient world. But this migration was different. This time the travelers were us, anatomically and cognitively modern humans, and this journey would lead to the peopling of the entire planet. The route they took began in the northeastern reaches of Africa, through what we now call the Sinai Peninsula, or possibly across the narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. The climate at this time was in the grip of an ice age, and sea levels had dropped significantly as water became locked in vast glaciers. This created a land bridge, or at least a much narrower crossing point than exists today. The archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that the migrants followed the coastlines, a strategy that makes intuitive sense. Coastal environments offered reliable food sources, shellfish, fish, and the plants that grew near the shore. The migration may have been gradual, each generation moving just a little further along the coast, establishing temporary camps, and following the resources they had learned to harvest. These early travelers moved eastward along the southern coast of Arabia and continuing toward the Indian subcontinent. The journey must have taken thousands of years, countless generations born and dying along the way, each knowing nothing of where their distant descendants would eventually arrive. Archaeological sites in the Arabian Peninsula have revealed stone tools and evidence of human presence dating to this period, though the harsh desert that covers much of the region today has buried or eroded many traces of these ancient wayfarers. Genetic studies of modern populations have provided a fascinating window into this migration. By analyzing the DNA of people from different parts of the world, scientists can trace lineages backward through time and reconstruct the patterns of ancient movement. The evidence shows that all non-African populations today descend from this single dispersal event around 60 to 70,000 years ago. The genetic diversity found in African populations is far greater than anywhere else on Earth, confirming Africa as the homeland of our species and suggesting that the founding population that left was relatively small, perhaps just a few thousand individuals. The coastal route hypothesis gains support from the surprisingly early dates of human arrival in distant lands. Archaeological evidence from Australia indicates that humans had reached that continent by at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. To arrive in Australia required crossing significant stretches of open ocean, even during periods of lower sea level. This tells us something profound about the capabilities of these early migrants. They had watercraft, whether simple rafts or more sophisticated boats we may never know, and they had the courage and navigational skills to venture across waters where the far shore might not even be visible. The journey to Australia would have required island hopping through what is now Indonesia and Southeast Asia. During the Ice Age, many of these islands formed larger land masses, but substantial water crossings remained. Each crossing was an adventure into the unknown, a leap of faith that somewhere beyond the horizon lay habitable land. That humans successfully made these journeys speaks to their resourcefulness, their ability to plan and cooperate, and perhaps to their sheer curiosity about what lay beyond the next wave. While some groups moved southward and eastward toward Australia, others continued along the Asian coastlines or turned inland to explore the great river valleys and plains of South and Central Asia. The archaeological record from these regions during this period is still being uncovered, with new discoveries regularly pushing back the dates of human presence. Stone tools, hearths, and the remains of meals left behind provide glimpses of how these people lived as they adapted to new environments. The migration into Europe came later, perhaps around 45,000 years ago, though isolated earlier incursions may have occurred. Europe at this time was home to the Neanderthals, who had adapted to its challenging climates over hundreds of thousands of years. The arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe would lead to one of the most intriguing chapters in human prehistory, a meeting between two human species that would have consequences neither could have imagined. The routes into Europe likely followed multiple paths. Some humans may have traveled along the Mediterranean coasts, while others moved through the Middle East and into the Balkans, or possibly followed river valleys northward from the Black Sea region. The archaeological record shows a relatively rapid spread of Homo sapiens populations across Europe once they arrived, bringing with them more sophisticated stone tool technologies and artistic traditions that leave us spectacular evidence of their presence. As these migrations unfolded across tens of thousands of years, the humans involved were not consciously exploring or colonizing in any modern sense. They were simply living, following game, seeking shelter, raising children, and occasionally moving to new territories when resources became scarce or populations grew. Yet the cumulative effect of countless small movements was monumental. From a single origin point in Africa, humans spread across Asia, reached Australia, and entered Europe, adapting to deserts, rainforests, temperate woodlands, and eventually even Arctic environments. The genetic and archaeological evidence continues to reveal new details about these ancient journeys. Each discovery, whether a new fossil site, a refined dating technique, or a more sophisticated genetic analysis, adds another piece to the puzzle. What becomes clear is that the human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and perseverance carried our species across seemingly insurmountable barriers. Mountains, oceans, deserts, and ice sheets all presented challenges that our ancestors found ways to overcome. As these early Homo sapiens dispersed across the continents, They carried with them the African origins of our species, but they were also beginning to diverge, adapting to new environments and developing the distinct cultural traditions that would, over time, lead to the remarkable diversity of human societies. The journey out of Africa was not just a physical migration. It was the beginning of humanity's transformation into a truly global species, one whose descendants would eventually look up at the same moon from every continent and wonder about their place in the cosmos. As modern humans spread across the landscapes of Eurasia, they entered territories already inhabited by other human species. These weren't abstract encounters lost to time, but meetings between different branches of humanity that had evolved in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. The story of these encounters, written into the very structure of our DNA, reveals one of the most fascinating chapters in human evolution. When our ancestors moved into Europe and Western Asia around 50,000 years ago, they encountered the Neanderthals, who had lived in these regions for over 200,000 years. These weren't the brutish cavemen of old imagination, but sophisticated humans adapted to Ice Age climates, with their own technologies, cultures, and ways of understanding the world. For tens of millennia, two human species shared the same continents, sometimes the same valleys and caves. The evidence for these encounters comes from multiple sources. Archaeological sites show overlapping time frames, where both species occupied the same regions. In some caves, layers containing Neanderthal artifacts lie just above or below layers with early modern human tools, suggesting these groups may have occupied the same shelters at different times, perhaps even aware of each other's presence. But the most compelling evidence comes from an entirely unexpected source. In 2010, scientists successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome from ancient bones, allowing them to compare Neanderthal DNA with that of living people around the world. The results surprised many researchers. Modern humans of European, Asian, and Native American ancestry carry between 1% and 3% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This genetic legacy could only have arrived through interbreeding between the two species. The DNA evidence tells us that this mixing occurred relatively early in the expansion of modern humans out of Africa, probably in the Middle East, where both species overlapped between 60 and 50,000 years ago. Small amounts of interbreeding appear to have happened repeatedly during the thousands of years when the two populations coexisted. Each encounter, each family formed across species lines, left traces that persist in billions of people today. But Neanderthals weren't the only other humans our ancestors met. Far to the east, in the caves of Siberia's Altai Mountains, scientists discovered fragments of a finger bone and a few teeth that belonged to yet another human species, named Denisovans, after the cave where they were found. These people are known almost entirely from their genetic material. The DNA extracted from these sparse remains revealed a population that had diverged from Neanderthals hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Remarkably, modern humans interbred with Denisovans as well. The genetic signatures of these ancient encounters appear most strongly in present-day populations of Melanesia, Australia, and Southeast Asia, where some individuals carry up to 6% Denisovan ancestry. This suggests that modern humans met and mixed with Denisovans somewhere in Eastern or Southeastern Asia. As they expanded across the continent, the story becomes even more intricate when we examine specific genes inherited from these ancient relatives. Some of the DNA segments we received from Neanderthals and Denisovans affect our immune systems, helping our ancestors adapt to new diseases they encountered in unfamiliar environments. Other inherited genes influence skin and hair characteristics, possibly providing advantages in different climates. One particular gene variant from Denisovans, common in Tibetan populations today, helps the body cope with low oxygen levels at high altitudes, a remarkable gift from an extinct species that has helped their descendants thrive on the roof of the world. These genetic exchanges went both ways. Recent analysis suggests that modern humans also contributed DNA to Neanderthal populations, indicating that the interactions were more complex than a simple one-directional mixture. Over thousands of years, in various locations across Western Eurasia, the barriers between species proved permeable. Not all inherited genes proved beneficial, however. Some Neanderthal DNA segments appear to have been selected against over time, gradually decreasing in frequency in modern human populations. Certain regions of our genome contain almost no Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting that some genetic combinations were disadvantageous and were slowly removed by natural selection over hundreds of generations. The discovery of interbreeding between human species has profound implications for how we understand our own nature. The boundaries between species, once thought to be absolute barriers, turn out to be more fluid than previously imagined. Our ancestors were pragmatic and adaptable, forming relationships and families across what we might consider species lines. In this sense, the Neanderthals and Denisovans never entirely went extinct. Parts of them continue within us, carried forward through time in the genes of their hybrid descendants. Scientists continue to find evidence of other possible human populations. Genetic analysis hints at additional ghost lineages, groups that left traces in our DNA but whose fossils remain undiscovered. In Africa, where modern humans evolved, there appear to be genetic signatures suggesting interbreeding with archaic human populations that had diverged from our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years earlier. These revelations paint a picture of a world once rich with human diversity, where multiple human species and populations overlapped, interacted, and occasionally merged. Our journey out of Africa wasn't a simple story of one species replacing all others, but a complex narrative of meetings, exchanges, and the gradual blending of lineages that had evolved in isolation. As we carry forward the genetic heritage of these vanished peoples, we carry too the story of human adaptability and connection. The encounters between different human groups, played out across millennia in countless individual lives now lost to time, shaped who we are today. In our DNA resides a library of ancient meetings, a testament to the complex and interconnected nature of human evolution. As modern humans emerged from their encounters with other human species, they carried within them not just genetic traces of those meetings, but an extraordinary capacity for adaptation that would soon be tested in every environment Earth had to offer. The story of how our ancestors spread across the entire globe is one of remarkable ingenuity, patience, and perseverance, played out over thousands of generations. From the regions where Homo sapiens had already established themselves in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and parts of Europe, small groups continued their gradual expansion into territories no human had ever seen. Each movement into new lands was not a sudden conquest, but a slow, almost imperceptible drift across landscapes, following game, seeking shelter, discovering new resources. Over centuries, human footprints appeared in places that would have seemed impossibly remote to those African ancestors who first gazed out beyond their homeland. The expansion into northern latitudes presented challenges unlike any these tropical adapted creatures had faced before. As some groups moved deeper into what is now Siberia, they encountered winters of devastating cold and darkness. Yet humans proved extraordinarily inventive. They developed sophisticated clothing from animal skins, constructed insulated shelters, and learned to survive where even Neanderthals had struggled. Archaeological sites in Siberia reveal evidence of human presence stretching back over 30,000 years, with remains of elaborate dwellings built from mammoth bones, covered in hides and earth to keep out the brutal cold. The movement into the far reaches of Asia brought humans to coastlines, looking out over vast oceans, yet water proved no permanent barrier. In Southeast Asia, groups developed remarkable seafaring skills, even in an age long before writing or metal tools. Around 50,000 years ago, people successfully crossed significant stretches of open ocean to reach the landmass known today as Sahul, which included Australia and New Guinea, before rising seas separated them. This journey required boats or rafts capable of carrying entire families with supplies across dozens of miles of water, suggesting considerable planning and maritime knowledge. The descendants of these voyagers became the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians, whose continuous connection to that continent represents one of the longest-lasting cultures on Earth. The Pacific Ocean, Earth's largest feature, eventually witnessed perhaps the most impressive feat of ancient exploration. Beginning around 3,000 years ago, people we now call the Lapeta culture began an extraordinary expansion across the Pacific Islands. Starting from islands near New Guinea, these master navigators developed sophisticated double-hulled canoes and an intimate knowledge of stars, currents, and bird behavior. Generation after generation ventured into the unknown, discovering and settling islands scattered across millions of square miles of ocean. They reached Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, then later Hawaii, Easter Island, and finally New Zealand, completing the last major human colonization of uninhabited lands, perhaps just 800 years ago. The Polynesians, as their descendants are known, achieved a mastery of oceanic navigation that remained unmatched until relatively recent times. The Americas tell another remarkable chapter in this global story. For many years, scientists debated when and how humans first arrived in the Western Hemisphere. The evidence now suggests that people first entered the Americas sometime before 15,000 years ago, possibly significantly earlier, though the precise timing remains a subject of active research. The most widely accepted route involves movement across Beringia, the land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska during periods of lower sea level in the Ice Age. Groups following game animals gradually moved eastward across this region, eventually finding routes south as massive ice sheets began to retreat. Once south of the continental ice, human expansion through the Americas was remarkably swift in geological terms. Within a few thousand years, human presence had been established from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego at South America's southern tip, an extraordinary span of both latitude and environmental variation. These first Americans demonstrated the same adaptive flexibility their ancestors had shown elsewhere, developing distinct cultures suited to the dense rainforests of the Amazon, the high altitudes of the Andes, the temperate woodlands of eastern North America, and the challenging deserts of the Southwest. Each environment demanded its own innovations. In the Arctic regions of North America and Greenland, groups known as Paleo-Eskimos, and later the ancestors of modern Inuit peoples, perfected techniques for surviving in one of Earth's most demanding climates. They developed specialized toggling harpoons for hunting seals, constructed igloos as temporary shelters, and created warm, layered clothing that remains the basis for cold weather gear even today. Their intimate knowledge of ice, weather, and animal behavior represented countless generations of accumulated wisdom, passed down through careful observation and teaching. In more temperate zones, human populations developed different strategies. Some became specialized hunters of large game, following herds across grasslands. Others focused on rich coastal resources, establishing settlements near rivers and shores, where fish, shellfish, and marine mammals provided reliable food sources. Still others learned to exploit the particular plants and animals of forests, deserts, or mountains, each group developing detailed environmental knowledge specific to their homeland. This global expansion created something unprecedented in Earth's history, a single species inhabiting virtually every terrestrial environment the planet offered, from equator to polar regions, from sea level to high mountain valleys, from humid rainforests to arid deserts. Where other species might have diverged into multiple forms adapted to these different environments, humans instead relied on cultural adaptation. Rather than evolving different bodies for different climates, they invented clothing, shelter, and tools to survive anywhere. By 10,000 years ago, this phase of expansion was essentially complete. Humans had reached every habitable continent and countless islands. Small bands of people lived in isolated valleys, along remote coastlines, and in territories separated from other human groups by thousands of miles. Yet all shared the same basic biology, the same remarkable brain, and the same capacity for innovation that had carried their ancestors out of Africa and around the world. This extraordinary dispersal set the stage for the next great transformation in human existence, one that would arise independently in several different parts of the world, changing forever how humans lived on Earth. As our human ancestors spread across every corner of the globe, adapting to frozen tundras and scorching deserts, tropical rainforests and windswept plains, they remained fundamentally hunter-gatherers. For tens of thousands of years, people lived by tracking game animals, gathering wild plants, fishing in rivers and seas, and moving with the seasons. This lifestyle had sustained humanity through countless generations, through ice ages and warm periods, through migrations across continents and oceans. But around 12,000 years ago, in several different parts of the world, something remarkable began to happen. People started to settle down. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. In the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through modern-day Iraq, communities began spending more time in permanent settlements. The warming climate at the end of the last ice age had created favorable conditions. Wild grains like wheat and barley grew abundantly in these regions, and people discovered they could harvest enough to store for lean times. Settlements appeared along riverbanks and near reliable water sources, simple structures of stone and mud brick replacing temporary shelters. Then came the crucial insight that would transform human existence. People observed that seeds dropped near their settlements would sprout the following season. They began deliberately planting seeds, tending the growing plants, and harvesting the results. Agriculture was born not from a single moment of invention, but from countless observations and experiments repeated across generations. By around 10,000 years ago, communities in the Fertile Crescent were actively cultivating wheat, barley, lentils, and peas, managing these plants rather than simply gathering what grew wild. This agricultural revolution emerged independently in different parts of the world, each region domesticating the plants native to its environment. In China, communities along the Yellow River began cultivating millet around 9,000 years ago, while people along the Yangtze River grew rice. In Mesoamerica, the transformation of a wild grass called teosinte, through careful selection, eventually produced maize or corn, though this process took thousands of years. In the highlands of the Andes, people domesticated potatoes and quinoa. In Africa's Sahel region, communities cultivated sorghum and African rice. In New Guinea, people developed agriculture based on taro and bananas. Animals too became partners in this new way of life. Dogs had already joined human communities thousands of years earlier, but now other species followed. Sheep and goats were among the first. Domesticated in the Fertile Crescent around the same time, crops were being cultivated. Cattle came next, then pigs. In other regions, different animals served human communities. Llamas and alpacas in the Andes, water buffalo in Asia, chickens originating from Southeast Asian jungles. Each domestication changed both the animal and the humans who tended them, a partnership that reshaped both species over time. The shift to agriculture brought profound changes that rippled through every aspect of human existence. Reliable food sources meant people could support larger populations. Villages grew into towns. With storable surpluses of grain and domesticated animals, not everyone needed to spend their days producing food. Some people could specialize in making pottery to store the harvest, others in weaving textiles from domesticated plant fibers or animal wool. Skilled craftspeople emerged, creating tools specifically designed for farming, reaping, and processing grain. Human bodies themselves began to change in response to this new lifestyle. Adults in farming communities developed the ability to digest milk from domesticated animals, a genetic adaptation that appeared in several populations independently. Diets rich in grain affected dental health and jaw structure. The archaeological record shows farmers were often shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, likely due to less diverse nutrition, though their communities could support far more people on the same amount of land. Permanent settlements created new challenges and opportunities. People needed to track harvests, count stored grain, and remember planting cycles. Systems of marking and notation appeared, eventually evolving into writing in several civilizations. Social structures became more complex as populations grew, and wealth accumulated in the form of stored food and domesticated animals. Some individuals acquired more resources than others, and societies developed new forms of organization to manage these differences. The transformation was not universally beneficial. Farming required long hours of labor, often backbreaking work in fields under the hot sun. Hunter-gatherers typically enjoyed more leisure time and more varied diets than early farmers. Permanent settlements brought people and animals into close proximity, creating conditions where diseases could spread more easily. Living in one place meant dealing with waste and sanitation in new ways, and relying on stored grain made communities vulnerable to crop failures, droughts, or pests in ways that more mobile hunter-gatherers were not. Yet there was no going back. Farming communities could support populations far larger than the land could sustain through hunting and gathering alone. Once a region adopted agriculture, population growth meant the wild resources that had previously sustained hunter-gatherers became insufficient. Farming spread not necessarily because it made individual lives easier or healthier, but because it enabled more people to live on the same land, and those populations then expanded into new territories. By 6,000 years ago, agricultural societies existed on every inhabited continent except Australia, where Aboriginal peoples maintained their traditional ways of life for tens of thousands of years more. The surplus food produced by farming communities enabled the rise of the first cities, the first written languages, the first large-scale political organizations. The agricultural revolution set in motion the development of everything we consider civilization, from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt to the classical societies of Greece, Rome, India, and China. And so we arrive at the threshold of recorded history, where the story of human evolution merges with the history we learn from written documents. Our journey has taken us from the ancient primates moving through African forests, to early hominins taking their first bipedal steps, to multiple human species spreading across the world, to that sole surviving species, Homo sapiens, colonizing every land and then settling down to reshape the very landscape. We carry within us the legacy of this long journey, in our bones shaped for walking upright, in our brains that grew large enough to imagine and create, in our DNA mixed from encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans, in our adaptations to countless different environments. We are a young species, perhaps 300,000 years old, and yet we are the inheritors of a story billions of years in the making, a story of life itself unfolding on this planet. As you drift towards sleep, you carry that ancient heritage within you, connected through an unbroken chain to every generation that came before, part of an ongoing story whose next chapters are still being written. As we bring to a close our journey through the remarkable story of human evolution, from our ancient ancestors taking their first steps to the diverse family of humans we are today, we hope these tales of discovery and migration have gently carried you through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration of our shared past. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help other smart sleepers find their way here. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer. And may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.